What if you're not living in the first human civilization, but the seventh? A clay prism sits in a climate-controlled vault at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Four-sided, 20 centimetres tall, the weight of a paperback book. Its surface is covered in wedge-shaped impressions, cuneiform script pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago in the Mesopotamian city of Larsa. Herbert Well Blundell discovered it in 1922, extracted it from Iraqi soil, and brought it to England, where it would become catalogue number AN 1923-444. The Well Blundell prism contains the most complete version of the Sumerian king list ever found. Column by column, it records the rulers of ancient Sumer from the very beginning of kingship to roughly 1800 BCE. Cities rise and fall, dynasties transfer. Kings with recognisable reign lengths succeed one another in orderly fashion. 23 years, 15 years, 7 years, the kind of numbers that make chronological sense. But the beginning doesn't make sense at all. The text opens with a simple statement: after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it names a king called Alulim, who ruled in that first city. His reign length is recorded as 8 sars, a Sumerian numerical unit equal to 3,600 years, 28,800 years for a single ruler. His successor Alalangar reigned for 10 sars, 36,000 years, 5 cities, 8 kings, a combined total of 241,200 years of kingship before a single line changes everything. Then the flood swept over. After that watershed statement, the reign lengths drop dramatically. Suddenly, we're reading about kings who ruled for decades, not millennia. The numbers become plausible, historical, archaeologically confirmable. Some of these later kings, like Gilgamesh of Uruk, almost certainly existed as real human beings. So what were the Sumerian scribes recording in that opening section? Why preserve such impossible numbers with the same bureaucratic precision they used for verifiable history? And why does every surviving copy of this king list, fragments found in different cities, written centuries apart, maintain this identical structure: antediluvian kings with cosmic lifespans, a catastrophic flood, then the restart with human-scale history? This wasn't one scribe's fantasy. This was institutional memory, copied and recopied by the temple scribes who served as Mesopotamia's archivists. These were the people who invented writing, who developed mathematics and astronomy, whose administrative records were so meticulous that we can reconstruct their economic systems down to individual grain transactions. They did not confuse mythology with documentation, yet they documented this. The text doesn't treat these antediluvian rulers as legends or gods. It places them in specific cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, real locations that archaeologists have excavated. It uses the same formula for every king, before and after the flood: name, city, reign length. The format doesn't change, the precision doesn't waver. Only one element marks the divide between the two sections: that single declarative sentence about water sweeping over everything. Take a moment, comment below where you're listening from and what time it is wherever you are, because we're about to spend time examining a question that might change how you understand human history. If the Sumerian king list isn't mythology, if it isn't religious allegory, if it isn't the confused conflation of multiple traditions, what is it? What if these ancient scribes, sitting in their temple scriptoriums with their reed styluses and their wet clay, were doing exactly what they claimed to be doing, keeping a record, not of one civilization's kings, but of something far stranger: a pattern, a cycle, a sequence of human attempts to organize society, each one ending in catastrophe, each one requiring a restart. What if we're not the first to do this? What if the Sumerians knew we weren't the first? What if they kept records because they understood that knowledge must survive the next time it happens? The prism sits in its vault, waiting. The wedges pressed into its surface 4,000 years ago remain perfectly legible. The clay remembers everything. The question is whether we're ready to remember what the clay recorded. Before, the waters rose. Southern Mesopotamia circa 3500 BCE. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers carve through an alluvial plain so flat that a person standing on the ziggurat at Ur could see the horizon curve away in every direction. Marshlands, reed beds, seasonal floods that leave behind silt rich enough to grow barley without effort. No stone, no timber, no metal deposits. Just mud, water and the sky meeting the earth at the edge of perception. Then suddenly, cities. Not villages that gradually grew into urban centres, not the slow accumulation of population and infrastructure that characterises most early civilizations. Within a few centuries, fully formed city-states with monumental architecture, complex administrative systems, specialised labour forces, and a writing system sophisticated enough to record not just transactions, but literature, law and scientific observations. The Sumerians appeared in history already civilised. This has never sat comfortably with evolutionary models of cultural development. When archaeologists first excavated Uruk in the late 19th century, they expected to find layers showing gradual progression from simple to complex. Instead, they found the Uruk period, roughly 4000 to 3100 BC, characterised by sudden innovations that have no obvious antecedents. The potter's wheel, the plough, administrative tablets using an already functional numeric system, cylinder seals with sophisticated artistic motifs, temples built on massive platforms requiring coordinated labour from hundreds of workers. Where did they come from? The Sumerians themselves wrote in a language unrelated to any known language family, not Semitic, not Indo-European, a linguistic isolate that shares no demonstrable connection with any other human tongue. Their neighbours spoke Akkadian and other Semitic languages. The Sumerians spoke something older, something that arrived in Mesopotamia fully formed, with no evident proto-language preserved in the archaeological record. Samuel Noah Kramer, the great Sumerologist of the 20th century, titled his most famous book, History Begins at Sumer. He catalogued the firsts attributed to this civilization, the first schools, first legal codes, first bicameral congress, first taxation system, first written literature, first proverbs, first farmer's almanac. The list runs to dozens of innovations that subsequent civilizations would adopt, adapt and claim as their own foundations. But Kramer worked from an assumption shared by most scholars of his era that these innovations represented original inventions, that the Sumerians developed these systems through trial and error, through the slow accumulation of knowledge over generations, through human ingenuity responding to environmental and social pressures. The Sumerians themselves never claimed this. In their own texts, civilization came from elsewhere. Knowledge was not discovered, but transmitted. The arts of writing, kingship, priesthood, warfare, music, metalworking, these were called the Mi, a Sumerian concept that has no precise English equivalent. The Mi were the fundamental powers or principles that made civilization function. They were not human inventions. They were cosmic principles that someone had to acquire, often through trickery or divine favour. The most famous story involves Inanna, the goddess of Uruk, travelling to Eridu to visit Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet water. Enki, in his deep temple called the Abzu, possessed all the Mi, over 100 of them. The text lists them: lordship, godship, the noble enduring crown, the throne of kingship, the exalted sceptre, the noble garments, shepherdship, kingship, the numerous priestly offices, truth, the standard, the descent into and ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the kissing of, the phallus, prostitution, the art of straightforward speech, the art of slanderous speech, the art of ornamented speech, the cult prostitute, the holy tavern, the art of song, eldership, hearership, power, enmity, straightforwardness, the destruction of cities, lamentation, rejoicing of the heart, falsehood, the rebel land, goodness, justice, the craft of the woodworker, the craft of the metalworker, the craft of the scribe, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leatherworker, the craft of the fuller, the craft of the builder, the craft of the reed worker. The list continues. Each Mi is specific, concrete, essential to the functioning of a complex society. And crucially, none of them are invented. They exist. They must be possessed. Inanna gets Enki drunk and steals them, loads them onto her boat, and brings them back to Uruk. When Enki sobers up and realises what happened, he tries to retrieve them, but it's too late. Uruk now has the me. Civilization transfers from Eridu to Uruk, not through conquest or cultural diffusion, but through the physical movement of these cosmic principles. This is not how cultures talk about invention, this is how cultures talk about inheritance. Before the Sumerians, there was the Ubaid period. From roughly 5500 to 3700 BC, a distinct culture occupied southern Mesopotamia. They built simple mud brick structures, created distinctive painted pottery with geometric patterns, established the first permanent settlements at sites that would later become Sumerian cities. At Eridu, archaeologists found 18 successive temple levels, the earliest dating to the Ubaid period. 18 rebuilds of the same sacred structure on the same sacred ground, each one slightly larger than the last, each one oriented in exactly the same direction. Someone was maintaining continuity across millennia. Someone was preserving the memory of where the first temple had stood and ensuring that subsequent temples honoured that location. This is not the behaviour of a culture starting from scratch. This is the behaviour of a culture rebuilding according to a plan that predates the current iteration. The transition from Ubaid to Uruk is architecturally continuous but culturally discontinuous. The pottery changes style abruptly. The language, when we can finally read it in the Uruk period, is Sumerian, not whatever the Ubaid people spoke. The population seems to have changed, yet the temples remain in the same locations, following the same orientations, serving the same deities. Eridu, the city named first in the king list, was considered the oldest city by the Sumerians themselves. Archaeological excavation confirms continuous occupation at Eridu from the Ubaid period forward. The Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian text preserved on a tablet catalogued as CBS 10673 at the Penn Museum, describes Eridu as the place where kingship first descended from heaven. Before any other city existed, Eridu existed. Before any other temple existed, Enki's temple at Eridu existed. The text is fragmentary, damaged by time and water, but what survives is telling. It describes the creation of humans to serve the gods, to maintain the temples, to work the fields. It describes the establishment of 5 cities, the same 5 cities mentioned in the antediluvian section of the king list: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar and Shuruppak. It describes how the gods grew annoyed with humanity's noise and decided to destroy them with a flood. And it describes how Ziusudra, a pious king who served the god Enki, was warned in time to build a boat. The flood comes, 7 days and 7 nights of rain and wind. When it ends, Ziusudra opens a window in his boat and makes offerings to the sun god. The gods, regretting their destructive impulse, grant Ziusudra eternal life and settle him in Dilmun, a paradisiacal land at the edge of the world. Then, after the gap left by the destroyed section of the tablet, the text resumes with a post-flood world. Kingship descends again. Cities are re-established. Civilization resumes. The same structure, the same pattern. Antediluvian world, catastrophic flood, post-flood restart. The Sumerian king list isn't unique in preserving this framework. It's one example of a broader Mesopotamian understanding that what came before was different from what came after. That something ended. That something had to begin again. But if civilization had to restart, that implies civilization existed before. If the Sumerians were rebuilding, what were they rebuilding? If they inherited the me rather than inventing them, who had the me before the flood swept over? The archaeological layers at Eridu go deep. Below the Ubaid levels, there are earlier occupations stretching back into the 6th millennium BC. Simple structures, ceramic traditions that suggest connections with cultures to the north and east, population movements, cultural exchanges, the normal messy process of human migration and settlement. But nowhere in that archaeological record is there a gradual invention of cuneiform writing. Nowhere is there the slow development from simple pictographs to the complex syllabic system the Sumerians used. Writing appears suddenly in the Uruk period, already functional, already capable of recording complex ideas. The earliest tablets, from roughly 3200 BC, found at Uruk and Jemdet Nasser, are not primitive experiments. They are bureaucratic documents using a standardized system of signs to record economic transactions. Either the Sumerians developed writing so quickly that the intermediate stages leave no archaeological trace, or writing was not developed in Mesopotamia at all. Perhaps it was remembered. Perhaps it was restored from a system that had existed before and had been lost. The Sumerian worldview did not include the concept of cultural progress as we understand it. They did not believe they were standing on the shoulders of primitive ancestors, gradually climbing toward greater sophistication. They believed they lived in the shadow of an earlier time when the gods walked among humans, when the Mi were fresh and powerful, when the first cities were established according to divine blueprint. Everything since then had been maintenance, preservation, the slow degradation of a perfect system handed down from the beginning. This creates a strange inversion when we try to understand Sumerian texts. We read them through a lens of development and progress. They wrote them through a lens of inheritance and decline. We assume they're describing the invention of civilization. They may have been describing its restoration. 8 kings, impossible years. The antediluvian section of the Sumerian king list consists of 8 names, 5 cities, and a total of 241,200 years. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalengar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Enmen Luana of Bad Tibera, 43,200 years. Enmen Gal Ana of Bad Tibera, 28,800 years. Dumazid of Bad Tibera, 36,000 years. Ensipad Zid Ana of Luruk, 28,800 years. Enmen Jurana of Sipar, 21,000 years. Ubaratutu of Shurupuk, 18,600 years. Then the flood swept over. Every mainstream scholar who has studied this list agrees on one point: these numbers cannot be literal. No human being lives for 28,800 years. The antediluvian section must therefore represent something else. Mythology, symbolic chronology, the compression of dynasties into individual reigns, the conflation of divine and human rulers, or simply the legendary prehistory that many ancient cultures invented to give their historical records a suitably impressive beginning. Thorkild Jacobson, whose 1939 study The Sumerian King List remains the foundational scholarly work on this text, argued that the antediluvian section was likely a later addition to a king list that originally began with the post-flood period. He noted that several copies of the king list omit the antediluvian section entirely, starting instead with the first dynasty of Kish, the dynasty that supposedly received kingship after the flood. Jacobson suggested that scribes added the antediluvian rulers to push the origins of kingship back to an even more remote past, giving their institution great antiquity and divine sanction. This is a reasonable interpretation based on textual analysis. Some copies omit the pre-flood section, therefore the pre-flood section might not have been part of the original composition. The logic is sound, but it doesn't explain why multiple independent copies, including the Weld Blundell prism, the most complete version, do include the antediluvian section. It doesn't explain why tablet WB62, discovered separately and containing only the antediluvian rulers, exists at all. If this section was a late addition, someone went to considerable effort to preserve it on a dedicated tablet, suggesting it had independent significance beyond serving as a prologue to the main king list. WB62 sits in the Ashmolean Museum alongside the Weld Blundell Prism. It's a small clay tablet, inscribed only on the obverse, containing just the pre-flood kings. The catalogue entry notes it was unearthed from an uncertain provenance, likely somewhere in southern Iraq, probably dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BC. The script is clear, professional, the work of a trained scribe copying a known text. This wasn't a marginal note or speculative addition. This was documentation worth preserving on its own. The University of California at Berkeley houses another fragmentary king list, catalogue number UCBC 9-1819, also referenced as SHME 9-01819 in the Hearst Museum collection. This tablet includes portions of the antediluvian section with variant spellings of some kings' names but identical reign lengths. The scribe who pressed these signs into clay was working from the same tradition as the scribe who created the Weld Blundell Prism, even though they were separated by geography and possibly time. The tradition was stable, the numbers were consistent, the structure was preserved. This consistency across multiple copies created in different cities over centuries suggests something more than invented mythology. When ancient scribes invented genealogies or king lists for political purposes, they tended to produce unique versions tailored to local needs. But the antediluvian section of the Sumerian king list shows remarkable agreement across all extant copies. The same 8 names, the same 5 cities, the same mathematical structure, and that mathematical structure is worth examining. The reign lengths are not random numbers. They're multiples of the Sumerian numerical unit called a sar, which equals 3,600, Alulim 8 sars, Alalungar 10 sars, Enmen Luana 12 sars, Enmengalana 8 sars, Dumuzid 10 sars, Ensipadzidana 8 sars, Enmendurana 5 sars plus 30 ners, Arner equals 600, Ubaratutu 5 sars plus 6 ners. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal system, base 60, which they developed to astronomical precision. Their mathematical tablets demonstrate sophisticated understanding of abstract numerical relationships. They could calculate square roots, work with geometric progressions, and track celestial movements across decades. They were not mathematically naive. So when they recorded these antediluvian reigns in neat multiples of their largest time unit, they were doing something deliberate, not inventing arbitrary large numbers to convey a very long time, but using their formal mathematical notation to record specific values. Some scholars have suggested the sar might represent something other than years, perhaps months, or some other chronological unit that would make the reign lengths more plausible. If each sar equals 30 days instead of 3,600 years, Alulim ruled for 240 days. If each sar equals 30 years, he ruled for 240 years. These alternatives bring the numbers into quasi-believable range, but the text doesn't support this reading. After the flood, the king list continues to use years as its unit of measurement, and those post-flood years are clearly annual years based on archaeological confirmation of later kings' reigns. The text doesn't indicate a change in time units at the flood boundary. It maintains the same formulas, the same grammatical structures, the same notational system. Only the magnitude changes. A tablet from Tel Harmal, catalogued as IM 63095 in the Baghdad Museum, provides another version of the antediluvian list discovered by scholar J.J. Finkelstein in 1963. Finkelstein published his analysis in the Journal of Cuneiform Studies under the title The Antediluvian Kings, a University of California tablet. This version includes some variations in the names, but preserves the same essential structure: 8 kings, cosmic lifespans, 5 cities, the flood as watershed. The persistence of this tradition across time and space suggests it was important enough to keep copying, important enough to preserve even when scribes were creating abbreviated versions of the king list that cut out dynasties and compressed centuries into summary statements. The antediluvian section remained. The impossible numbers remained. What could those numbers mean if not literal years? One possibility, they represent genealogical depth. Not 8 individual kings, but 8 dynasties, each name standing for a succession of rulers whose combined reigns totaled the given years. This would push the actual chronology back by a factor of however many generations each king represented. If Elulim represents a dynasty that lasted 288 years, assuming average reign of 20 years for 14 sequential rulers, the total antediluvian period becomes manageable, perhaps 2400 years instead of 241,200. But this interpretation requires reading something into the text that isn't there. The king list doesn't say the dynasty of Elulim. It says Elulim became king, he reigned 28,800 years. The formula is consistent with every other entry in the list, before and after the flood. If Elulim is really multiple rulers, then so is every post-flood king, and we know that interpretation doesn't work for figures like Gilgamesh, who appears as a single individual both in the king list and in literary texts. Another possibility, the numbers encode astronomical cycles. Some scholars have noted that 241,200 years is suspiciously close to various long-count calendrical periods used by ancient astronomers to track planetary motions and predict eclipses. The Sumerians were skilled observers of the heavens. Perhaps they embedded their astronomical knowledge into the king list as a form of data storage, using the pre-flood kings as mnemonic devices for cosmic cycles. This is creative, but it requires assuming the Sumerian scribes were being deliberately obscure, encoding information in a format that provides no decoding key. Throughout their other texts, when Sumerians wanted to record astronomical data, they created astronomical tablets with clear numerical notations and geometric models. They didn't hide their celestial observations inside historical chronicles. A third possibility, rarely voiced in academic literature, but impossible to ignore when reading the text itself, what if the scribes recorded what they believed to be true? Not that individual humans lived for 28,800 years. The Sumerians understood human mortality as well as we do. Their literature is filled with meditations on death, with heroes like Gilgamesh raging against the inevitability of the grave. They knew people died. But what if the antediluvian section represents something other than individual rulers? What if those 8 names mark epochs, periods of time during which civilization existed but operated under different conditions? Ages measured not in human lifespans, but in the duration of stable social orders. Consider the post-flood section of the king list. After the flood, kingship descends again, this time to Kish. The first dynasty of Kish lists 23 kings with combined reigns of 24,510 years, still impossibly long, but notably shorter than the antediluvian total. Then the second dynasty of Uruk, 5 kings, 2,356 years. The third dynasty of Ur, 4 kings, 171 years. The numbers are gradually approaching historical plausibility as the king list moves forward in time. This creates a gradient. The further back you go, the longer the reigns. The closer you get to the present from the scribe spec, the more realistic the chronology becomes. It's as if distance in time distorts measurement, or as if the early periods operated under different temporal conditions that the scribes could no longer fully comprehend, but faithfully recorded anyway. The flood itself provides no explanation for why time would behave differently before versus after, but it does mark the absolute boundary in the text. Whatever came before the flood was categorically different from what came after, not just in terms of chronology, but in terms of the fundamental nature of existence. The text states this plainly. Then the flood swept over. No elaboration, no description of the catastrophe, no moral lesson about why the flood occurred, just the bare fact of it, the world before. the flood, the world after. And crucially, after that declarative sentence, the text continues, after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Kingship descends from heaven again, the same way it descended the first time to Eridu. The language mirrors the opening of the antediluvian section, as if civilization needed to be restarted, as if the template had to be applied again, as if this had happened before and might happen again. The dividing line. The University of Pennsylvania expedition to Nippur in the 1890s uncovered thousands of cuneiform tablets from the temple libraries and administrative buildings of this ancient religious centre. Among them was a fragmentary tablet, later catalogued as CBS Tensu 673, that would become known as the Eridu Genesis or the Sumerian flood story. The tablet is broken. Sections of text are missing. What survives reads like a bureaucratic nightmare. We have the middle and end of some columns, the beginning and middle of others, tantalizing fragments that suggest the full narrative but never quite deliver it completely. Yet even in its damaged state, CBS 10673 preserves the oldest written account of the flood that destroyed the antediluvian world. The text begins, as far as we can tell from the surviving portion, with the creation of humans and the establishment of cities. The gods create people to maintain the temples, to provide offerings, to perform the labour necessary to keep the cosmic order functioning. 5 cities are founded and named: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Lurak, Sippar, and Shurupak. The same 5 cities listed in the antediluvian section of the king list. Kingship is established. The tablets record a sense of order, of proper function, of a world operating according to divine plan. But then something shifts. The text becomes fragmentary here, but the implication is clear. The gods grow disturbed by humanity, perhaps by their noise, perhaps by their multiplication, perhaps by something else that the damaged tablet doesn't preserve. The god Enlil decides to destroy humanity with a flood. The other gods agree, binding themselves by oath not to warn the humans of what's coming. But Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet water, finds a way around the oath. He doesn't directly tell Ziusudra, the pious king of Shurupuk, about the impending catastrophe. Instead he speaks to the reed wall of Ziusudra's house, knowing the king is on the other side listening. The text preserves Enki's words, filtered through the reed wall, pay attention, destroy your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, seek life, bring up the seed of all living things into the boat. Ziusudra obeys. The text doesn't describe the boat's construction in detail. That section is lost or was never included. But when the narrative resumes, the flood has begun. 7 days and 7 nights. All the windstorms and floodstorms attack as one. The tablet says, the boat is tossed about on the great waters. Everything above ground is destroyed. Then silence. The text breaks off. When it resumes, Ziusudra is opening a window in the boat, allowing sunlight to enter. He prostrates himself before the sun god Utu, makes offerings of oxen and sheep. The gods, smelling the savour of the sacrifice, gather around. They regret their decision. Anu and Enlil grant Ziusudra eternal life as compensation, settling him in Dilmun, the paradisiacal land at the world's edge. The next legible section deals with the re-establishment of cities and the restoration of kingship. The flood has ended. The world begins again. The pattern established before the flood resumes after it, but with one critical difference: the antediluvian world is gone forever. What comes after is new, or new enough to mark a boundary that would be remembered for millennia. This narrative framework, creation, cities, catastrophic flood, restoration, appears not just in Sumerian texts, but throughout Mesopotamian literature. The Atrahasis epic, written in Akkadian around 1700 BCE, tells essentially the same story with different details and a different flood hero. Multiple tablets preserve this epic, including fragments from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh and old Babylonian copies from Sippar. In Atrahasis, the gods create humans to relieve themselves of labour. Humans multiply rapidly. After 1200 years, their noise becomes unbearable to the god Enlil, who tries several times to reduce the population through plague, drought, and famine. Each time, Enki intervenes to save humanity through the wisdom he imparts to Atrahasis, a particularly clever human. Finally, Enlil decrees a flood to eliminate humanity entirely. Again, Enki warns his chosen human. Atrahasis builds a boat, brings his family and animals aboard, and survives the 7-day deluge. When the gods smell his post-flood sacrifice, they realize they've made a mistake. They need humans to feed them through offerings. So they allow humanity to repopulate the earth, but with modifications, shorter lifespans, infant mortality, and barren women are introduced to keep the population manageable. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its standard version, compiled around 1200 BC, incorporates the flood narrative into Tablet C. Here the flood survivor is called Utnapishtim, and he lives at the edge of the world where Gilgamesh travels seeking the secret of immortality. Utnapishtim tells his story to the Uruk king, how the gods decided to flood the earth, how Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, warned him by speaking to his reed hut, how he built a cube-shaped boat covered in pitch, how he loaded his family and animals and craftsmen aboard, how the storm lasted 6 days and 7 nights, how his boat came to rest on Mount Nimush, how he sent out birds to test whether the waters had receded. The story ends with the gods granting Utnapishtim and his wife immortality as unique, never to be repeated compensation for their survival. The point is clear. This happened once. The old world ended. A new world began. No human would ever again witness such a complete destruction, and no human would ever again be granted eternal life for surviving it. These 3 versions, Eridu Genesis, Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, span over a millennium of Mesopotamian literary tradition. They come from different cities, different time periods, different languages, Meran and Akkadian. Yet they preserve a core narrative framework with remarkable consistency: antediluvian world, divine decision to destroy, one human warned by a sympathetic god, boat construction, 7-day storm, landing on a mountain or the waters receding, sacrifice, divine regret, restoration of humanity. Mainstream scholarship interprets this as mythology, a culturally specific story explaining why bad things happen, why humans are mortal, why civilization exists in its current form. The flood functions as narrative device, not historical memory, a way to separate the mythological past, when gods and humans interacted freely, from the historical present, when divine contact is rare and intermediated through priests and rituals. But the Mesopotamians themselves treated the flood as historical fact. When they compiled king lists, they used it as the primary chronological marker. Everything was dated either before the flood or after. The flood wasn't a metaphor. It was an event so significant that it fundamentally reorganized how time was measured and how history was understood. Archaeologists working in Mesopotamia in the early 20th century found evidence that seemed to support this memory. Sir Leonard Woolley, excavating at Ur in the 1920s, discovered a thick layer of clean alluvial clay separating earlier and later occupation layers. He measured it at 8 feet thick in some areas, a substantial deposit that suggested massive flooding. Woolley famously announced he had found evidence of Noah's flood, though he later moderated this claim to suggest a catastrophic regional flood that could have inspired the biblical and Mesopotamian narratives. Other sites showed similar evidence. At Kish, excavators found flood deposits dating to approximately 2900 BC, separating the Jemdet Nasser period from the early dynastic Thai period. At Shuruppak, the city of Ziusudra in the Eridu Genesis, archaeologists uncovered flood layers that seemed to mark a significant disruption in occupation. But the geological evidence is complicated. Different sites show flood deposits at different chronological levels. The flood layer at Ur doesn't correspond temporally to the flood layer at Kish. Some major Sumerian cities show no evidence of catastrophic flooding at all during the relevant periods. Modern geological analysis suggests that what Woolley found at Ur was probably a local flood event, significant but not civilization ending. This doesn't disprove the flood tradition, it contextualizes it. Mesopotamia, built on the floodplains of two major rivers, experienced regular devastating floods. The Tigris and Euphrates were unpredictable, their flooding patterns dependent on distant snowmelt and rainfall the Mesopotamians couldn't anticipate. Cities were periodically destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed again. Flood was an existential reality, not an abstract mythological concept. But the flood remembered in the king list and the flood narratives is different in kind. It's not a flood, it's the flood, the one that marks the ultimate boundary, the one after which kingship had to descend from heaven again, as if something more fundamental than individual cities had been destroyed and needed reconstitution. The phrase then the flood swept over contains no geographic markers. It doesn't say a flood swept over Shuruppak or floods destroyed the southern cities. It says the flood swept over, implying totality, the world before the flood, the world after. Everything changes at that line, and yet civilization continues. The king list immediately states that after the flood, kingship descended again to Kish, not to Eridu, the first antediluvian city, but to Kish in the north. New city, same institution, same divine mandate, same organizational structure, as if the template for civilizations survived the destruction of its physical manifestation. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the flood destroyed everything, how did the survivors know how to rebuild? How did they know kingship was supposed to descend from heaven? How did they know which gods to worship, which temple forms to construct, which administrative systems to implement? Unless someone remembered, unless someone carried forward the pattern, unless someone ensured that what came before the flood wouldn't be entirely lost when the flood swept over. Survivors and secret keepers, Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, 3 names, 3 languages, 3 versions of the same figure. The flood survivor who preserves humanity and, more importantly, preserves the knowledge of how to be human. In the Eridu Genesis, Ziusudra is described as pious and humble, a king who pays careful attention to divine instructions. The gods grant him eternal life and place him in Dilmun after the flood, effectively removing him from human history. He becomes immortal, but at the cost of continuing participation in the world he saved. In the Atrahasis epic, the protagonist is specifically identified as wise. His name, Atrahasis, means extremely wise in Akkadian. When the gods send plagues, he doesn't panic. He consults with Enki, who teaches him specific countermeasures. When drought threatens, Enki shows him how to redirect divine attention to break the famine. When the flood comes, Atrahasis knows not just to build a boat, but to bring craftsmen aboard, the people who possess technical knowledge of metalworking, woodworking, and other essential skills. He's not just saving lives, he's saving civilization's capacity to function. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim tells his story to explain why Gilgamesh's quest for immortality is futile. The flood happened once. The gods granted immortality once. Those conditions will never be repeated. But Utnapishtim does give Gilgamesh something, knowledge of a plant that restores youth. The plant grows at the bottom of the cosmic ocean, guarded by supernatural forces, but Utnapishtim knows where it is, because he has been to the edge of the world and back. He possesses information unavailable to those who were born after the flood. In all 3 versions, the flood survivor is more than a passive beneficiary of divine favour. He is an active preserver of knowledge. He listens when gods speak to read walls. He asks questions. He follows instructions precisely. He brings not just animals but people, not just biological diversity but cultural continuity. And critically, he is always warned in advance. The flood is not sudden. It is planned by the gods, debated among them, implemented according to divine decision. The warning comes through Enki, the god of wisdom, who consistently acts to preserve humanity despite the will of other gods to destroy it. Enki doesn't just save random individuals. He chooses wisely, selecting those who will best carry forward what needs to be carried. This pattern, advanced warning, selective survival, preservation of knowledge, appears throughout Mesopotamian literature dealing with catastrophe. It's not unique to the flood narrative. The Error epic, a later Babylonian text, describes how the god Error, associated with plague and warfare, nearly destroys civilization in a fit of rage. Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, is temporarily absent from his city, having been tricked into leaving his throne. In Marduk's absence, Error convinces the other gods to let him unleash destruction. Cities burn, populations are decimated, chaos reigns. But before the destruction reaches its completion, Isum, Error's minister, intervenes. He speaks words of wisdom, calming Error, reminding him that total destruction serves no purpose. The gods need humanity. Civilization must continue. Error relents, but not before making the point that he could return at any time, that his patience is finite, that humanity exists at divine sufferance. The text ends with instructions to preserve the tablet itself. Anyone who copies this text and keeps it in their house will be protected from Error's wrath. Knowledge of the catastrophe and its resolution becomes a form of protection against future catastrophe. The text functions as both warning and shield. This idea that knowledge of past destruction helps prevent or survive future destruction permeates Mesopotamian thought. It's why they kept records with such obsessive precision. It's why temple libraries preserved texts for centuries, copying them when they deteriorated, maintaining archives that stretch back to the founding of cities. The past wasn't dead history to be studied by curious scholars. The past was active instruction for an uncertain future. Berossus, the Babylonian priest who wrote in Greek during the 3rd century BC, preserved a version of the flood story that includes a crucial detail missing from earlier Mesopotamian sources. In his account, before the flood, the god Enki instructs the survivors to write down the history of the antediluvian world and bury the texts in Sippar, the city of the sun. After the flood, the survivors are to dig up these records and transmit their contents to future generations. Berossus's account is preserved only in fragments quoted by later writers like Josephus and Eusebius, so we can't be certain how much of this detail is original Babylonian tradition versus Berossus's own interpretation. But the idea that knowledge was deliberately preserved through the catastrophe, buried and recovered, transmitted forward, this makes sense within the Mesopotamian worldview. Sippar, notably, is one of the 5 antediluvian cities listed in the king list. It was sacred to Shamash, the sun god, associated with justice and revelation. If texts were to be buried anywhere for safekeeping through cosmic catastrophe, Sippar would be the logical choice. A city sacred to the god who brings light and truth, who sees everything, who judges fairly. The knowledge would be safe there, protected by divine authority until it could be retrieved and used again. Whether or not this literally happened is less important than what it reveals about how Mesopotamians thought civilization persisted through catastrophe, not by accident, not by simple survival, but by deliberate preservation of essential knowledge, by chosen individuals who understood what needed to be saved. The flood survivor in all versions is singular, one man, one family, one boat. The god doesn't save many people and let them sort out how to rebuild. He saves a specific person who already knows how civilization works, who already understands kingship and priesthood and agriculture and animal husbandry, someone who can restart the system because they were part of the system before it ended. This creates a paradox. If the flood destroyed the antediluvian world so completely that kingship had to descend from heaven again, How did the survivors retain knowledge of their antediluvian civilization? How did they know what kingship was? How did they know which gods to worship and how to worship them? The texts offer no explanation. They simply assert continuity through catastrophe. Ziusudra becomes immortal in Dilmun. Atrahasis repopulates the earth. Utnapishtim dwells at the world's edge. All of them removed from normal human society. All of them possessing knowledge that predates the current world. All of them available, at least theoretically, to teach future generations what was learned before the waters rose. Gilgamesh seeks Utnapishtim not just for immortality, but for knowledge. He travels to the edge of the world because he wants to understand what death means, what life means, what survives when everything else is destroyed. Utnapishtim's answer is essentially conservative. Nothing survives permanently. The plant of youth is stolen by a serpent. Immortality was granted once and never again. The flood destroyed the old world, and the new world operates under different rules. But Gilgamesh returns to Uruk with something. Not immortality, but perspective. Not youth restored, but wisdom gained. He has spoken with someone who witnessed the flood. He has heard the story of how everything ended and how everything began again. That knowledge changes him. The epic concludes with Gilgamesh accepting his mortality and taking pride in his city, in the walls he built, in the lasting works that will outlive him. The flood survivor, in this reading, is not just a rescuer of biological humanity. He is a teacher, someone who has seen the ultimate catastrophe and can testify to what matters, what survives, what should be preserved. The knowledge he carries forward is not technical instructions for building boats or planting crops. It's deeper understanding of the cyclical nature of existence, the fragility of civilization, the importance of maintaining the institutions that organize human life. The Mesopotamians believed these figures existed, not as abstract myths, but as ancestors whose experiences shaped the world they inherited. The flood wasn't prehistoric speculation. It was recent enough that its survivors could be contacted, consulted, remembered. Recent enough that the break it created was still felt, still mourned, still used as the primary organizing principle for understanding time. And if the flood was that recent, that real, that foundational, what came before it was equally real. The antediluvian cities existed. The antediluvian kings ruled. The 241,200 years might be measured differently than post-flood years, but they represented actual time, actual history, actual events preserved through catastrophe by people who understood what needed to be saved. The 7 who came before. Before the 8 kings, there were 7 sages. The Apkallu tradition, preserved in multiple Mesopotamian texts from different periods, describes 7 wise beings who emerged from the ocean before the flood and taught humanity the arts of civilization. They came from the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater realm associated with the god Enki, and they served as advisors to the antediluvian kings. Each of the first 5 antediluvian cities had its own Apkallu. Uana, also called Uanes in Greek sources, served Eridu. Uaniduga served Bad Tibera. Enmeduga served Larak. Enmegalamma served Sippar. And Enlilda served Shuruppak. The last 2 Apkallu, Utuabzu and Anuduga, are sometimes associated with Shuruppak as well, though the traditions vary. These were not human sages. The texts describe them as part fish, part human, creatures equally comfortable in water and on land, possessing knowledge from before human civilization existed. They taught writing, mathematics, architecture, agriculture, metalworking, law, and religious ritual. Every fundamental aspect of civilized life came from them, not from human invention or discovery. Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BC, preserved the most detailed description of the first Apkallu, whom he calls Oannes. His account, though filtered through Greek language and sensibilities, captures the essential strangeness of the tradition. In the first year there appeared, from that part of the Erythraean Sea which borders upon Babylonia, an animal destitute of reason, by name Oannes, whose whole body, according to the account of Apollodorus, was that of a fish, that under the fish's head he had another head, with feet also below, similar to those of a man, subjoined to the fish's tail. His voice too, and language, was articulate and human, and a representation of him is preserved even to this day. This being was accustomed to pass the day among men, but took no food at that season, and he gave them an insight into letters and sciences and arts of every kind. He taught them to construct cities, to found temples, to compile laws, and explained to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. He made them distinguish the seeds of the earth, and showed them how to collect the fruits. In short, he instructed them in everything which could tend to soften manners and humanize their lives. From that time, nothing material has been added by way of improvement to his instructions. And when the sun had set, this being Oannes, retired again into the sea, and passed the night in the deep, for he was amphibious. Berossus goes on to note that after Oannes, other similar beings appeared during subsequent reigns, each adding to the store of knowledge, each contributing specific technical skills or cultural practices. By the time of the flood, humanity possessed complete knowledge of civilization, not through gradual trial and error, but through direct instruction from these non-human teachers. The Mesopotamian versions of the Apkallu tradition are less detailed about their physical appearance, but consistent about their function. They are described in Sumerian as Abgal, meaning sage or expert, possessing perfect wisdom. In Akkadian texts they are Apkallu, with the same meaning. They are always associated with Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet water, emerging from his domain to interact with humanity. A tablet from Uruk, catalogued as W2030-7 and published in 1962 by scholar Van Dyck, lists 7 antediluvian sages parallel to 7 antediluvian kings. This parallel structure is significant. Just as the king list preserves a sequence of 8 rulers in some version, or 7 rulers before the flood, the Apkallu tradition preserves 7 sages. The numbers don't match exactly across all sources, but the pattern is consistent. A specific, countable number of authoritative figures who establish civilization before the flood destroys it. The Error epic mentions the Apkallu in passing, noting that Error's rage killed them, presumably in an earlier catastrophe or during the flood itself. After their destruction, the text says, only mortal sages remain, humans who tried to maintain the knowledge the Apkallu had taught, but who lacked perfect wisdom. This creates a narrative of decline. The original teachers possessed complete knowledge, then they vanished. Then humans attempted to preserve what they could remember, but something essential was lost in the transmission. The Enmeduranki tradition adds another layer. Enmeduranki Lenderana in Sumerian is the 7th antediluvian king in most versions of the king list, the ruler of Sippar. According to texts from Nippur and elsewhere, Enmeduranki was taken up to heaven by the gods Shamash and Adad, who taught him the arts of divination, how to interpret oil on water, how to read the liver of sacrificed animals, how to understand celestial omens. They revealed to him the secrets of heaven and earth, then returned him to Sippar with instructions to teach these arts to humans. Enmeduranki founded the guild of diviners and priests who would maintain these practices. He received the divine tablets and stylus, the tools of cosmic knowledge. Then, before the flood, he transmitted this knowledge to his son, ensuring it would survive the catastrophe. This story parallels certain biblical traditions about Enoch, the 7th patriarch, before the flood in Genesis, who walked with God and was taken up to heaven without dying. Enoch traditions in Jewish literature, particularly the Book of Enoch, describe him receiving heavenly knowledge and bringing back cosmic secrets to teach humanity. The structural similarities between Enmeduranki and Enoch suggest a common Near Eastern tradition of the seventh pre-flood figure as recipient and transmitter of divine wisdom. The number 7 appears repeatedly in these traditions. 7 Apkallu, 7 kings in some version. The 7th king receives special knowledge, 7 days and nights of flood. 7 is not random in Mesopotamian numerology, it's sacred, representing completeness, a full cycle, perfection. What's striking about the Apkallu tradition is its explicit statement that civilization was taught, not invented. The texts don't describe humans slowly figuring out how to write or developing agriculture through experimentation. They describe non-human beings emerging from the water with complete knowledge and deliberately transmitting it. Writing isn't invented, it's revealed. Mathematics isn't discovered, it's taught. Kingship isn't developed through social evolution, it's instituted according to divine instruction. This creates a problem for modern interpretation. We know writing developed gradually. We can see the progression in archaeological layers from simple token systems to pictographic representations to full syllabic scripts. We know agriculture emerged through millennia of plant domestication and selection. We know metallurgy advanced through experimentation and accumulated technical knowledge. But the Mesopotamians didn't describe it that way. They described it as received knowledge transmitted from beings who already possessed it. And they were the ones who developed writing, so they would have known if it was a gradual process. They were the ones who invented the complex administrative systems that organised their cities. They would have experienced the trial and error involved in creating new social technologies, yet they chose to remember it differently. They chose to preserve traditions that attributed their civilization to external sources, to teachers who came before, to knowledge that predated human cities. Why? One possibility, the Apkallu tradition, explains rapid cultural development. If the Sumerians did appear with fully functional civilization in a relatively short time frame, they might have needed an explanation for how that was possible. Saying beings from the water taught us is more satisfying than saying we don't know how we learnt this so quickly. Another possibility, the tradition preserves actual historical memory of knowledge transmission from an earlier culture. Not fish beings from the ocean, but refugees or survivors from a different region or earlier period who brought advanced knowledge with them. The non-human appearance might be mythological elaboration on the fundamental strangeness of encountering people with superior knowledge and unfamiliar customs. A third possibility, the Apkallu are symbolic representations of the concept of inherited knowledge itself. They personify the idea that what makes us civilized comes from outside us, from ancestors, from tradition, from accumulated wisdom that no single generation creates, but each generation must preserve and transmit. Whichever interpretation we favour, the Apkallu tradition serves a clear function in Mesopotamian thought. It establishes that civilization is not invented, it is inherited, passed down, received, and therefore it can be lost if the transmission fails, if the teachers are destroyed, if the knowledge is not carefully preserved through whatever catastrophes might come. The flood kills the Apkallu. After the flood, only human sages remain, people like Atrahasis and Ziusudra, who possess wisdom but are not the original sources of that wisdom. The post-flood world operates with derivative knowledge, copies of copies, human memory of what the perfect teachers once transmitted. This creates a narrative arc of decline that pervades Mesopotamian literature. The beginning was better. The first kings reigned longer. The first cities were more perfect. The original knowledge was complete. Everything since has been maintenance, preservation, the slow degradation of an ideal that can never be fully restored. Unless it happens again, unless kingship descends from heaven again, unless the cycle repeats and civilization gets another chance to start from the template, to receive the knowledge freshly, to rebuild according to the plan the Apkallu taught before the waters rose. The gifts that cannot be invented. The Sumerian word me has no satisfactory English translation. Scholars have rendered it variously as divine powers, cosmic principles, cultural elements, essential functions, or simply left it untranslated as me. Each translation captures part of the concept, but misses something essential. The me are simultaneously abstract and concrete. They are both the principle of kingship and the physical regalia of kingship. They are the concept of writing and the physical tablet and stylus. They are the idea of music and the actual musical instruments. They exist as cosmic realities, but manifest as tangible objects and practices. Most importantly, the me are not invented. They exist independently of humanity, and they must be acquired, transferred, stolen, or granted. No Sumerian text describes a human creating a me. They describe humans obtaining the me, often through trickery or divine favour, and bringing them to their cities where they can be implemented. The most famous account of me transfer is the story of Inanna and Enki, preserved in multiple copies from different periods. Inanna, the goddess of Uruk, desires to increase her city's power and prestige. She travels to Eridu, where Enki guards all the me in his subterranean temple, the Abzu. Enki welcomes her with a feast, and during the celebration he drinks heavily. In his intoxicated state, he offers Inanna the me, group by group, over 100 of them. The text lists them methodically. He gave her the high priesthood, he gave her godship, he gave her the noble and enduring crown, he gave her the throne of kingship, he gave her the noble sceptre, he gave her the staff and crook, he gave her the noble garments, he gave her shepherdship of the land, he gave her kingship, he gave her the numerous priestly offices. The list continues through dozens of entries, covering every aspect of civilized life: the arts of warfare, the arts of love, the arts of craftsmanship, the arts of music, the arts of judgment, the arts of lamentation. Each one a discrete me, a transferable element of cultural function. Inanna accepts each gift, loads the me onto her boat of heaven, and sails away toward Uruk. When Enki sobers up and realizes what he's done, he sends his minister Isimud to retrieve the me. 7 times, Isimud confronts Inanna at various stopping points along her journey, demanding she return what Enki gave while drunk. 7 times, Inanna refuses, claiming Enki's gifts were legitimate and binding. 7 times, she escapes with the me intact. When Inanna finally arrives in Uruk, she unloads the me at the quay, and the city erupts in celebration. Uruk now possesses what Eridu once monopolized: the balance of power shifts. Civilization transfers from one city to another, not through conquest or gradual cultural diffusion, but through the physical movement of these cosmic principles. This narrative structure repeats throughout Sumerian literature. Civilization is portable. Knowledge can be transferred whole. Cities rise to prominence by acquiring the me, and they decline when the me are taken away. No city develops its own unique civilization through independent invention. They all participate in the same cosmic system, and the question is always who controls access to the essential functions that make civilization work. Another text, Enki and the World Order, describes how Enki travels through the known world, distributing the me to different lands and peoples. He visits Sumer, Ur, Meluha, Dilmun, and other regions, giving each place its specific functions and characteristics. He assigns to Sumer the arts of agriculture and herding. He gives the marshlands their fish and reeds. He establishes the mountain lands as sources of minerals and timber. Each region receives its ecological and cultural identity through Enki's deliberate distribution. Inanna appears in this text as well, complaining that she hasn't received her fair share of the me. Enki responds by listing everything he's already given her, a long catalogue of powers and privileges. But Inanna is never satisfied. She always wants more, always seeks to expand Uruk's portion of the civilizational pie. The text portrays this as her essential character, ambitious, grasping, never content with what she has. What's absent from these texts is any notion of innovation or invention. No Sumerian deity creates a new me. No human discovers a me through experimentation. The me exists from the beginning, complete and perfect, held by Enki in his underwater temple. The only question is how they get distributed among the gods and through the gods to human cities. This worldview has profound implications for how the Sumerians understood their own history. If civilization's essential functions existed before humans implemented them, then human civilization is necessarily derivative. It's the application of pre-existing principles to specific contexts. The Sumerians weren't the first civilization, they were the first to successfully access and implement the me in the post-flood world. Or perhaps not even the first in the post-flood world. Perhaps they were merely the most successful at preserving and transmitting what earlier cities had accessed. Perhaps multiple civilizations rose and fell, each one accessing some portion of the me, each one losing them again through catastrophe or divine disfavour, until finally Sumer achieved stable enough conditions to maintain the system. The Sumerian concept of education reflects this understanding. Schools, adubas or tablet houses focused on memorization and replication, not innovation. Students learn to write by copying standard lists of professional titles, lists of trees, lists of gods, lists of stones, lists of animals. The goal was to reproduce exactly what the teacher wrote, to maintain the tradition without deviation. Advanced students copied literary texts, legal formulae, mathematical problems, astronomical observations, always with the aim of perfect reproduction. Scribes who introduced variations or errors into copied texts were failures, not creative interpreters. Knowledge was something to be preserved unchanged across generations, not something to be developed or improved. This makes sense if you believe the knowledge you possess came from the Apkallu, who received it from Enki, who possesses it perfectly in the Abzu. Your job as a human scribe isn't to create new knowledge, but to maintain what was originally transmitted. Innovation is degradation. Change is corruption. The perfect knowledge existed at the beginning, and everything since is an attempt to prevent its loss. The me appear in Sumerian texts about the flood as well. In some versions, part of what Ziusudra or the flood survivor preserves isn't just humanity, but the me themselves. If the me are physical as well as conceptual, if they can be loaded onto a boat, then they need to be physically rescued from the flood, just as people and animals do. This adds another dimension to the role of the flood survivor. He's not just saving lives, he's saving civilization itself in its tangible, portable form. He brings the me through the catastrophe so that when the waters recede and kingship descends from heaven again, the new civilization doesn't have to reinvent everything. It can implement the same system that worked before, the same divine principles that organize the antediluvian cities. Without the flood survivor, humanity would survive, but civilization would not. People would rebuild settlements, grow food, organize communities, but they wouldn't know how to establish kingship, how to create priesthood, how to perform rituals, how to write, how to calculate, how to craft metal. All of that would be lost, because the me would be lost. This explains why the flood narratives emphasize the survivor's wisdom. Atrahasis isn't just any human, he's the one wise enough to recognize what needs to be saved. He brings craftsmen aboard the boat because their knowledge is essential. He preserves the technical skills that implement the me. Without craftsmen, you might possess the abstract principle of metalworking, but you couldn't actually forge bronze. The me need human expertise to manifest. The post-flood world, in this understanding, operates with inherited me, transmitted through catastrophe by deliberate effort. Nothing in the post-flood world is new. Everything is restoration of what existed before. Cities are rebuilt on the same sacred sites because those sites were sacred before. Temples use the same ground plans because the ground plans come from the time when gods designed them directly. Kings follow the same rituals because the rituals were established by the Apkallu, who knew how to communicate with heaven. This creates a fundamental difference from how modern cultures think about progress and development. We assume each generation builds on the knowledge of the previous generation, gradually accumulating better understanding and more effective techniques. We believe in improvement, optimization, innovation as positive values. The Sumerians believed in maintenance, in preservation, in faithful transmission. They looked backward to a perfect origin point and measured everything by how well it replicated that original perfection. Their greatest achievements weren't new inventions, but successful preservation of old knowledge. If we take this worldview seriously, if we try to understand Sumerian texts through Sumerian assumptions, rather than imposing our assumptions on them, then the king list's impossible numbers make different sense. The antediluvian period wasn't measured by human lifespans, because it wasn't about human history. It was about the time when the me were being established, when the Apkallu were teaching, when the original template for civilization was being implemented in its perfect form. The flood destroyed that perfection. What came after was reconstruction, using the template that survived, but never quite achieving the original standard. The post-flood kings reigned for shorter periods because they were working with degraded conditions, diminished access to the me, fading memory of how things were supposed to work, unless it happens again, unless the cycle resets. Unless civilization number 8 gets the chance to start fresh with the me newly accessed from the Abzu, the survivors carrying forward what needs to be carried, the Apkallu potentially returning to teach again, when the earth still moved. In 1922, Leonard Woolley began excavations at Tel al-Muqayyar in southern Iraq, the ancient city of Ur, one of Sumer's most important urban centres. His expedition, sponsored by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, would continue until 1934, uncovering royal tombs, temple complexes, residential areas, and administrative buildings spanning 3 millennia of occupation. In 1929, Woolley's team was excavating a deep pit to establish the site's chronological sequence. They dug through layers of occupation, pottery sherds, brick walls, ash layers marking fires, the accumulated debris of urban life. At a depth of about 11 metres, they hit a thick deposit of clean alluvial clay. No artefacts, no organic remains, no indication of human presence. Pure sediment, 3 metres thick in some areas. The workers assumed they'd reached the natural base of the site, the point before human habitation began. But Woolley instructed them to dig deeper. Below the clay layer, they found more occupation debris, pottery of an earlier style, primitive structures, evidence of human activity from the Ubaid period, dating to roughly 4000 BC or earlier. Woolley examined the clay layer carefully. It was silt typical of river flooding, deposited when water carries suspended sediment that settles as the water stills. For 3 metres of silt to accumulate required massive flooding, not a seasonal overflow, but a catastrophic inundation that lasted long enough for that much material to settle out of suspension. He announced to the press that he'd found evidence of Noah's flood. The clay layer, he argued, represented the biblical deluge that destroyed the antediluvian world. The layer below the flood was pre-flood civilization. The layer above was post-flood rebuilding. The physical stratification matched the narrative structure of Genesis and, by extension, the Mesopotamian flood traditions that preceded it. The announcement caused international sensation. Archaeological proof of the Bible. Scientific confirmation of ancient narratives. Woolley was celebrated and criticised in equal measure, celebrated by those who saw this as vindication of scriptural truth, criticised by scholars who noted that a flood deposit at Ur, however impressive, didn't constitute evidence of a global or even regional deluge. Further excavations complicated the picture. Other sites in southern Mesopotamia showed similar flood deposits, but not at the same chronological level. Kish, about 200 kilometers north of Ur, had flood layers dating to approximately 2900 BC, centuries after Wuli's Ur flood. Uruk showed no significant flood layer during the relevant periods. Eridu had multiple flood deposits from different eras. Modern geological analysis suggests that what Wuli found was probably a localized flood event, significant for Ur, but not civilization ending. The Euphrates River historically shifted its course multiple times. A major channel change could inundate a city completely while leaving other areas unaffected. The 3-meter deposit at Ur might represent weeks or months of flooding in that particular location, devastating to the people who lived there, but not the universal catastrophe described in the flood narratives. Yet dismissing the archaeological evidence entirely misses something important. Mesopotamia experienced catastrophic flooding regularly. Cities were built on the floodplains of 2 massive rivers fed by distant snowmelt and seasonal rains. The Tigris and Euphrates were unpredictable, subject to spring surges that could overwhelm any defensive infrastructure the ancient cities might construct. A catastrophic flood would have been remembered. Multiple catastrophic floods, occurring across centuries, would accumulate into collective memory as the time of floods, compressing separate events into a single narrative. The flood tradition doesn't need one specific geological event to explain it. The tradition could be the distilled memory of recurring catastrophe, the pattern recognized across generations of watching cities drown. But the Mesopotamian texts don't describe multiple floods. They describe one flood, the event that divides before from after. The flood tradition in cuneiform sources is suspiciously unified. Different texts give different details about the flood hero, about which gods were involved, about how long the flood lasted, but they agree on the basic structure. Once, long ago, the world was different. Then water swept over everything. Then the world began again in its current form. This narrative unity suggests something more than accumulated folk memory of various local disasters. It suggests a specific cultural memory maintained deliberately across millennia. The Sumerians and their Akkadian successors used the flood as their primary historical marker because it represented a boundary they considered absolute and real. At Shuruppak, identified with the modern site of Tel Farah, excavations in the early 20th century revealed multiple occupation layers separated by flood deposits. One particularly significant flood layer dates to approximately 2900–2800 BCE, roughly contemporary with the Kish flood. This is notable because Shuruppak is the city of Ziusudra in the Eridu Genesis, the home of the flood survivor. If Shuruppak was flooded catastrophically in the late 4th millennium, that might preserve the core memory that feeds into the later flood traditions. The early dynastic period in Mesopotamian archaeology, roughly 2900–2750 BC, shows signs of significant disruption. Settlement patterns change. Some sites are abandoned, others grow rapidly. The archaeological record suggests population movements, political upheaval, possible environmental crisis. This is when the flood layers at Kish and Shuruppak appear. This is when the transition from Jemdit Nazar to early dynastic culture occurs. Could the king list's flood marker correspond to this period? If the antediluvian section represents everything before approximately 2900 BC, and the post-flood section begins with the first dynasty of Kish around 2900 BC, the chronology starts to align with archaeological evidence. The flood would mark the transition from pre-dynastic to dynastic civilization, from the Uruk-Jemdit Nasser periods to the early dynastic period, from a time of competing city-states to a time of organized kingship. This interpretation has problems. It requires compressing the 241,200 years of antediluvian kingship into perhaps a millennium of actual time, the Uruk period from roughly 4000 to 2900 BCE. It requires explaining why the first dynasty of Kish is also given impossible reign lengths totaling over 24,000 years if the flood was supposed to mark the transition to plausible chronology. And it doesn't account for why later scribes preserved the structure if they knew it was chronologically compressed. But it does suggest the flood tradition might preserve memory of actual catastrophic flooding that disrupted Mesopotamian civilization around the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE. Not a world-ending deluge, not Noah's flood covering the earth, but devastating regional floods that destroyed cities, killed populations, disrupted social systems, and required survivors to rebuild with whatever knowledge they could preserve. The earth, in early 3rd millennium Mesopotamia, was unstable. Rivers shifted course without warning. Seasonal flooding was unpredictable. Cities built levees and canals trying to control water flow, but those systems could fail catastrophically. A major flood could destroy decades of infrastructure, bury farmland under sterile silt, displace entire populations. In that context, the flood narrative makes historical sense. It preserves the memory of when everything changed, when the old cities were destroyed, when survivors had to rebuild. The theological elaboration, gods deciding to destroy humanity, one righteous man saved, is how cultures process catastrophe, explaining the inexplicable by attributing it to divine will. But underneath the theology, the memory, water rose, cities drowned, people died, survivors rebuilt. The Sumerians dated events by flood because flood was their existential reality. The question wasn't whether floods would come, but when, and whether their cities could survive. They built ziggurats as much for refuge as for worship, elevated platforms where people and livestock could retreat when the waters rose. They developed complex divination systems to predict floods, reading omens in sheep livers and watching river levels obsessively. They lived with the knowledge that everything they built could be destroyed in days, that their carefully maintained agricultural systems could be buried under silt, that their cities could become uninhabitable ruins. That civilization itself was contingent on the river's behaviour. This breeds a particular worldview, not confidence in permanent progress, but awareness of fragility, not faith in accumulating knowledge, but urgency to preserve what you have before the next catastrophe. Not innovation for its own sake, but maintenance of what's proven to work, because starting over from nothing is too devastating to contemplate. The flood tradition, understood this way, is both historical memory and cultural instruction. Yes, it happened. Yes, it could happen again. Yes, we survived by preserving essential knowledge. Yes, we rebuilt by following the template that worked before. Yes, kingship descended from heaven again because survivors remembered how kingship functioned and re-implemented the system. And perhaps this is speculation, but informed speculation. Perhaps the antediluvian section of the king list represents not the period immediately before one flood, but the accumulated history before multiple catastrophes. Perhaps the 241,200 years compress many cycles of building and flooding and rebuilding. Perhaps each of the 8 antediluvian kings represents a civilization that rose, stabilized, and was destroyed by water. Perhaps we are not civilization number 2. Perhaps we are civilization number 7 or 8 or 12, and the king list preserves what can be remembered of all the previous attempts, compressing them into a manageable sequence, maintaining the pattern even when the details are lost. The clay remembers. The silt layers at Ur and Kish and Shuruppak remember. The rivers remember their old courses and could return to them without warning. The survivors remembered to rebuild on the same sacred sites, to orient temples in the same directions, to implement the same systems that worked before the water came, and the scribes remembered to copy the king list, maintaining the record of how many times kingship had descended from heaven, how many times the flood had swept over, how many times the pattern had to begin again. The pattern in the clay. The Enuma Elish, when on high, begins with chaos. Apsu, the sweet water, and Tiamat, the salt water, exist mingled together before creation. No gods exist. No earth exists. Only undifferentiated water in primal darkness. Then the gods are born from this mingling. Younger generations of deities emerge, making noise, disturbing the primordial calm. Apsu grows irritated with their noise and decides to destroy them. His plan fails. E, the Akkadian name for Enki, learns of the plot and kills Apsu, taking control of the Apsu. Tiamat, enraged by her consort's death, creates an army of monsters to avenge him. The younger gods are terrified. They need a champion who can face Tiamat and her chaos army. Marduk, son of Ea, volunteers, but only if the gods grant him permanent supremacy. They agree. Marduk battles Tiamat, defeats her, splits her corpse in half, and uses the two halves to create heaven and earth. He organizes the cosmos, assigning gods their roles, establishing the calendar, positioning the stars. He creates humanity from the blood of Tiamat's defeated general, Kingu, so that humans can work and relieve the gods of labour. The Enuma Elish was recited annually during the Akitu festival in Babylon, a New Year celebration that symbolically renewed the cosmos and reaffirmed Marduk's kingship. The text's ritual function was to remind participants that order is not natural. Order is imposed on chaos. Order must be maintained through correct ritual, proper kingship, and acknowledgement of divine hierarchy. But the text also reveals something about Mesopotamian cosmology. Creation is not once and done. It's a continuous process. Chaos is always threatening to return. Tiamat is defeated, but not destroyed at an ontological level. The potential for chaos remains, and only Marduk's vigilance and the gods' cooperation keep it at bay. This cyclical understanding of order and chaos permeates Mesopotamian thought. The world isn't progressing towards some final state of perfection. It's balanced between competing forces, and that balance requires constant maintenance. If the rituals are not performed, if the temples are not maintained, if kingship fails, chaos returns. The cosmos doesn't collapse, it reverts to its original undifferentiated state, and creation must begin again. The Era epic makes this explicit. Era, the god of plague and warfare, nearly destroys civilization in a fit of rage. He burns cities, slaughters populations, overturns the cosmic order. Only the intervention of his minister Ishum prevents total dissolution. Marduk, who had left Babylon to have his divine regalia cleaned, a strange detail suggesting that even God's ritual objects can become polluted and need purification, returns to restore order. But the text makes clear that this could happen again. Era is still alive, still capable of destruction. His patience is finite. Humans must maintain proper behaviour, proper worship, proper social order, not because goodness is inherently valuable, but because transgression invites catastrophe. This worldview doesn't match linear time as we understand it. Modern Western culture inherited from Christianity a teleological view of history, creation, fall, redemption, final judgment. Time moves in one direction toward an endpoint. History is meaningful because it's progressing toward ultimate resolution. Mesopotamian culture operated with cyclical time. Events repeated. Patterns recurred. What happened before would happen again. The gods' moods were unpredictable, subject to divine politics and petty grievances. They could decide at any moment to destroy and remake. Humans existed at the mercy of these cycles, trying to navigate them through divination and ritual, but unable to escape them. The king list structure reflects this cyclical understanding. Kingship descends from heaven, dynasties rise and fall, cities gain and lose preeminence, wars redistribute power, floods destroy and survivors rebuild. Then kingship descends from heaven again, continuing the pattern. The phrase kingship descended from heaven appears multiple times in the text, not just at the beginning. After the flood, it descends to Kish. When Kish's power wanes, it's taken to Yanar Uruk. When Uruk's dynasty ends, it's taken to Ur. The kingship moves, but the pattern remains. The same institution, the same divine mandate, the same organizational principle transferred from city to city. This suggests that kingship descended from heaven might not mean a one-time event when the first king was created. It might mean the periodic re-establishment of the institution after catastrophic disruption. Each descent is a new beginning, a fresh implementation of the cosmic template. If this interpretation is correct, the antediluvian section and the post-flood section of the king list aren't different in kind, they're different in proximity to the scribes present. The antediluvian kings are distant enough that their details have blurred into cosmic numbers. The post-flood kings are close enough that their reigns can be remembered more precisely. But both sections describe the same cyclical process: kingship established, cities founded, civilization organized, catastrophe destroys everything, survivors implement the template again. How many times has this happened? The text doesn't say explicitly, but if we count the descents of kingship as markers of new cycles, we can tentatively reconstruct multiple iterations. First descent, antediluvian, beginning at Eridu, 8 kings across 5 cities, ended by flood. Second descent, post-flood, beginning at Kish. First dynasty of Kish lists 23 kings. The numbers are still enormous, 24,510 years total, but smaller than antediluvian totals. Third descent, possibly marked by the transfer to Uruk. The dynastic succession suggests disruptions, periods when the old order ended and needed reconstitution. Each subsequent dynasty in the king list might represent not merely political succession, but civilizational restart after partial or complete collapse. The pattern repeats at different scales. Sometimes a city's dynasty ends and kingship transfers intact to a new city. Sometimes catastrophe destroys the system entirely and it must be re-established from first principles. The Sumerian Akkadian conception of time doesn't distinguish sharply between mythological and historical past. For them, all past is equally real. The antediluvian kings existed with the same reality as the first dynasty of Kish. The Apkallu taught humanity with the same concreteness as historical scribes teaching in actual tablet houses. Time stretches back through multiple iterations of the same pattern, and only proximity to the present determines how much detail can be recalled. This creates a very different understanding of what the king list is documenting. It's not a king list in the modern sense, a linear succession of rulers within a continuous political entity. It's a pattern list, documenting the recurrence of cosmic principles across multiple implementations. When kingship descends from heaven, certain things happen in sequence, cities are founded, temples are built, laws are established, culture flourishes, expansion occurs, conflicts arise, decline begins. Catastrophe strikes, survivors preserve essential knowledge, kingship descends again. The cycle is longer than human memory can contain, so it gets compressed into lists and numbers that preserve the pattern if not the details. If we are civilization number 7 or 8 or 12, we exist within this cycle, not beyond it. The Sumerians who compiled the king list believed they were continuing a pattern that had existed before them and would exist after them. Their contribution wasn't inventing civilization, but maintaining it successfully long enough to document the pattern. And the documentation itself is part of the pattern. The flood survivor preserves knowledge through catastrophe. The Apkallu teach humanity what needs to be known. The scribes copy the tablets, ensuring the pattern is not forgotten. Each role is essential to the cycle's continuation. What breaks the cycle? The texts don't say. Perhaps Nothing breaks it. Perhaps this is simply how existence operates. Creation and destruction in endless alternation, each iteration slightly different in detail, but identical in structure. The gods will always decide to destroy. A sympathetic deity will always warn a righteous human. That human will always preserve what needs preserving. Civilization will always rebuild according to the template. Or perhaps the cycle can be escaped if the pattern is understood and consciously maintained. Perhaps that's why the texts exist, not to predict the next catastrophe, but to ensure that when it comes, the survivors will know what to do. They'll have the king list showing that this has happened before. They'll have the flood narratives explaining how previous survivors preserved knowledge. They'll have the ritual texts showing how to re-establish contact with the gods. They'll have the mathematical texts showing how to organise society. They'll have the me preserved in their tangible forms, ready to be implemented again. The clay tablets sitting in modern museums, the well-Blundell prism at the Ashmolean, CBS 1673 at Penn, UCBC 91819 at Berkeley, the Enuma Elish tablets in the British Museum. These are not just historical artefacts. In Mesopotamian terms, they're survival equipment. Templates for civilizational restart. Instructions for the next cycle. The Sumerians copied them obsessively because they understood something we've forgotten. Knowledge is fragile, civilization is contingent, catastrophe is inevitable. What separates successful restart from total loss is whether someone preserved the pattern. And the pattern says, this has happened before, this will happen again. When it does, remember what came before. Remember the 8 antediluvian kings, the 5 cities, the 241,200 years. Remember that kingship descends from heaven. Remember that the me can be acquired and implemented. Remember that civilization is not invented, but inherited. Remember that you are not the first to do this. Remember that you might not be the last. The Gilgamesh question. Gilgamesh appears in the king list as the 5th king of the 1st dynasty of Uruk. The text gives his reign length as 126 years, still implausibly long but orders of magnitude shorter than antediluvian rulers. His father, according to the list, was a Lilu, a term usually translated as demon or night spirit, suggesting Gilgamesh was semi-divine, born from supernatural union. Archaeological evidence confirms that a king named Gilgamesh ruled Uruk sometime around 2700 BCE. His name appears in other historical texts. Architectural works are attributed to him. He's treated in Sumerian literature as a real person, not a purely mythological figure. Later kings claim descent from him, establishing dynasties on the prestige his name carried. The Epic of Gilgamesh, compiled in its standard version around 1200 BC, but drawing on earlier Sumerian sources, tells the story of this historical king's search for immortality. The narrative begins with Gilgamesh oppressing his people through excessive demands, forced labour on building projects, sexual rights over brides. The gods respond to his people's complaints by creating Enkidu, a wild man to serve as Gilgamesh's equal and distract him from tyranny. Gilgamesh and Enkidu become companions. They undertake heroic adventures, travelling to the cedar forest to kill its guardian Humbaba, refusing the sexual advances of Ishtar and killing the bull of heaven she sends to punish them. Their exploits are grand, their fame spreads, but then Enkidu dies as divine punishment for killing Humbaba and the bull. Enkidu's death transforms Gilgamesh. For the first time, he confronts human mortality as personal reality rather than abstract concept. His friend's corpse decays before his eyes. After 7 days, a maggot falls from Enkidu's nose, and Gilgamesh realizes that death is final, irreversible, coming for him as it came for his companion. Gilgamesh flees Uruk, abandons his kingship, and begins a desperate quest. He seeks Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, the one human who escaped death by being granted eternal life. If Gilgamesh can find Utnapishtim and learn his secret, perhaps mortality can be overcome. The journey is arduous. Gilgamesh crosses the waters of death with the help of a ferryman. He reaches the edge of the world, where Utnapishtim dwells with his wife in the paradisiacal garden the gods granted them after the flood. And finally, Gilgamesh asks his question, how did you find eternal life? Utnapishtim's answer is Tablet C of the epic, the flood narrative. He tells Gilgamesh about the assembly of the gods, Ea's warning, the boat's construction, the 7-day storm, the landing on Mount Nimush, the birds sent out to test for dry land, the sacrifice that brought the gods swarming like flies. He explains that at the flood's conclusion, Enlil granted him and his wife immortality as unique, never to be repeated compensation. Gilgamesh listens to this story and understands its implications. There is no secret, there is no technique for achieving immortality. Utnapishtim's eternal life was a singular divine gift given under circumstances that will never recur. The flood happened once. The gods granted immortality once. That door is closed. But Utnapishtim offers Gilgamesh a consolation. He knows of a plant that grows at the bottom of the cosmic ocean, a plant that restores youth. Not immortality, but the ability to reverse aging, to renew life again and again. Gilgamesh dives to the ocean floor, retrieves the plant, begins his journey back to Uruk, intending to share this gift with his people. On the way home, Gilgamesh stops at a pool to bathe. While he's in the water, a serpent smells the plant's fragrance, emerges from the pool, and eats it. The snake sheds its skin and slithers away renewed. Gilgamesh loses the one hope he'd found. He returns to Uruk empty-handed, having gained nothing but the story of how Utnapishtim survived the flood. The epic concludes with Gilgamesh accepting his mortality. He returns to his city, resumes his kingship, takes pride in the walls he built around Uruk, walls that will outlast him, lasting works in the face of inevitable death. The text ends by inviting the reader to walk Uruk's walls, to inspect the brickwork, to marvel at the foundations. This is what survives. Not the individual, but the city. Not the king, but the kingship. Not human life, but civilization's continuity. This narrative is usually read as a meditation on mortality. Gilgamesh learns that death is universal, that the gods keep immortality for themselves, that human meaning must be found in accomplishments that outlast individual existence. It's a profound story, arguably the oldest exploration of mortality's meaning in world literature. But the narrative also reveals something about Mesopotamian chronology and memory. If Gilgamesh, a historical king around 2700 BC, travels to meet Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, the flood cannot be distant prehistory. Utnapishtim is still alive, still accessible at the world's edge. The flood happened recently enough that its survivor can be consulted. The king list places the flood before the first dynasty of Kish. Gilgamesh rules during the first dynasty of Uruk, which follows Kish in the list sequence. So from the king list perspective, perhaps 500 to 1,000 years separate the flood from Gilgamesh's reign, depending on how one interprets the compressed chronology. But in the epic, Gilgamesh treats the flood as ancient history. Utnapishtim lives at the world's edge, removed from normal human geography. The journey to reach him is difficult, supernatural, crossing boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary space. This suggests temporal as well as spatial distance. The flood is remote enough to be legendary, even though its survivor is still theoretically contactable. This creates a chronological puzzle. The king list preserves the flood as the critical boundary before which everything was different. The epic treats Gilgamesh as living long after the flood, but still able to seek its survivor. The Sumerian poem Gilgamesh and Aga portrays Gilgamesh interacting with Aga of Kish, whose dynasty supposedly received kingship immediately after the flood. These different texts place Gilgamesh at different temporal distances from the flood event. One solution: the flood was not a single event. Different catastrophes affected different cities at different times, and the tradition compressed these into one narrative flood while preserving multiple contradictory chronological placements. Another solution: the king list chronology is symbolic, not literal. The antediluvian section represents remote past, the post-flood section represents accessible history, and the boundary between them is conceptual rather than corresponding to a specific calendrical year. A third solution: Gilgamesh's quest to meet Utnapishtim is explicitly a journey out of normal time. By travelling to the edge of the world, Gilgamesh is travelling backward through the layers of creation, accessing a time that no longer exists in his present. Utnapishtim survives at the boundary between the antediluvian world and the current world, existing in both and neither. What's revealing is why Gilgamesh seeks Utnapishtim at all. He's not looking for flood wisdom or guidance on how to avoid future catastrophes. He's looking for personal immortality. He heard the tradition that one human escaped death, and he wants the same privilege. His quest is selfish, even narcissistic, the powerful king demanding exception from universal human fate. But the story he receives, the flood narrative, is not about individual salvation. It's about collective survival. Utnapishtim builds a boat large enough for his family, animals, craftsmen. He preserves the capacity for civilization to continue. His immortality is granted not for personal merit, but for performing a function, ensuring humanity doesn't go extinct, ensuring knowledge transfers across the catastrophe. Gilgamesh misunderstands what he's seeking. He wants Utnapishtim's reward without understanding Utnapishtim's role. He wants eternal life without accepting the responsibility of being a knowledge keeper, a tradition bearer, a civilization preserver. And so he fails. The plant is stolen. The secret proves unattainable. He returns to Uruk with nothing but a story, yet the story is what survives. Millennia after the historical Gilgamesh died, we still have the Epic of Gilgamesh. Scribes copied it, translated it from Sumerian to Akkadian, distributed it across Mesopotamia and beyond. It was found in the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, among the Amarna letters in Egypt, in the Hittite archives in Anatolia. The story spread wherever cuneiform writing spread, carried by scribes who recognized its importance. And embedded in that story is the flood narrative. Anyone who read or heard the Epic of Gilgamesh learned about Utnapishtim, the boat, the 7-day storm, the divine regret, the granting of immortality. The tradition was preserved not in specialized religious texts, but in popular literature, in the most famous story of the ancient Near East. This suggests deliberate cultural strategy. The flood tradition needed to survive because it contained essential information that catastrophe had happened before, that survival was possible through proper preparation, that knowledge must be preserved through transitions, that civilization could restart if survivors maintained the pattern. By embedding the flood story in Gilgamesh's quest narrative, the tradition ensured its own transmission. Entertainment carries information that pure documentation might not. People copy and recite texts they enjoy. They memorize stories with compelling characters and dramatic action. The flood narrative survives because it's nested inside the Gilgamesh story, and the Gilgamesh story survives because people wanted to hear it. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk having failed in his personal quest, but succeeded in something more important. He brings back the knowledge that mortality is universal, that meaning comes from building things that outlast individuals, that the walls around Uruk will survive when their builder does not. This knowledge, humility in the face of death, pride in lasting works, acceptance of human limits, this is what sustains civilization across generations. The historical Gilgamesh probably did build Uruk's walls. Archaeological evidence confirms major construction projects during the early dynastic period. The walls were real, substantial, impressive. They protected the city for centuries, Long after anyone remembered why they were built, or who built them, they stood. That's what survives catastrophe, not individuals, not personal memory, but physical structures, institutional patterns, recorded knowledge, and stories that encode essential information. Gilgamesh the man died around 2700 BCE. Gilgamesh the king endured through dynastic claims and architectural attribution. Gilgamesh the character survived through literary tradition, and woven through that character's story is the flood narrative, the memory of when everything ended and had to begin again. The question the epic raises isn't whether Gilgamesh found immortality, it's whether civilization can achieve it, whether the pattern can be maintained across enough cycles that it becomes permanent, whether human beings can learn to preserve what matters through whatever catastrophes the gods or nature or chance might send. Utnapishtim achieved personal immortality, but only by leaving normal human society and dwelling at the world's edge. Gilgamesh remained mortal, but his works survived. The question for any civilization is which model to follow, withdraw from the cycle or remain engaged, knowing that engagement means facing destruction repeatedly, rebuilding repeatedly, maintaining the pattern until it becomes so deeply embedded that even catastrophe cannot erase it. The Sumerians chose engagement. They built cities knowing they might flood. They kept records knowing they might be destroyed. They taught their children knowing those children would die. They maintained the pattern because the pattern was worth maintaining, even if no individual implementation lasted forever. Perhaps that's what civilization number 7 means. Not that we're the 7th attempt at creating civilization from nothing, but that we're the 7th successful maintenance cycle, the 7th time survivors preserved enough knowledge that civilization could restart at high complexity rather than beginning again from zero, the 7th iteration that kept the pattern intact enough to build on rather than having to rediscover. And if that's true, then Gilgamesh's journey to meet Utnapishtim represents something profound, the connection between current civilization and previous iterations, the ability to consult with survivors from earlier catastrophes, to learn from their experiences, to understand that this has happened before and will happen again, the acknowledgement that we are not the first and should not assume we'll be the last. The plant that grants youth grows at the bottom of the cosmic ocean, but Gilgamesh loses it to a serpent. Perhaps that's the point. Personal rejuvenation is not available. What's available is collective regeneration, civilization renewing itself through memory, tradition, and pattern maintenance. The serpent sheds its skin and emerges renewed. So too civilization sheds its failed iterations and emerges in new forms, but following old patterns, guided by survivors who remember what worked before, what Berossus remembered. In the 3rd century BC, approximately 2,000 years after Gilgamesh walked Uruk's streets, a Babylonian priest named Berossus wrote a history of his homeland in Greek. By this time, Mesopotamia had seen the rise and fall of the Sumerian city-states, the Akkadian Empire, the 3rd dynasty of Ur, the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, Persian conquest, and finally Hellenistic rule under Alexander's successors. Berossus wrote for a Greek-speaking audience under Seleucid patronage. His work, titled Babyloniaca, attempted to preserve Mesopotamian traditions in a language and format accessible to the new ruling culture. The original text is lost. What survives are fragments quoted by later writers, Josephus, Eusebius, Syncellus, who cited Berossus when discussing ancient chronology and flood traditions. Despite the fragmented preservation and cultural translation, what Berossus recorded about the antediluvian period is remarkably consistent with the much older Sumerian king list. He describes 10 kings before the flood, not 8 as in most Sumerian versions, but the same order of magnitude. These 10 kings ruled for a combined total of 120 saroi, each saros being 3,600 years, giving a total of 432,000 years, different from the Sumerian 241,200 years, but using the same numerical system, the same unit of measurement, the same conceptual framework. Berossus names the first antediluvian king as Aloros, who ruled in Babylon for 10 saroi 36,000 years. This corresponds to Alulim of Eridu in the Sumerian list, with variations in name and reign length, but identical structural position. The second king, Alaparos, matches Alangar. The pattern continues through the list with recognizable correspondences despite the phonetic shifts inevitable in translation from Sumerian to Akkadian to Greek. The 10th and final antediluvian king in Berossus's account is Sisuthros, clearly the same figure as Ziusudra, Mannalahan, or Utnapishtim, Kadien. Berossus describes him as a pious ruler to whom the god Kronos, the Greek name, substituted for Ea Enki, revealed that a great flood would destroy humanity. Kronos instructed Sisuthros to write down the history of the antediluvian world and bury the records at Sippar, the city of the sun. This detail, burying records at Sippar before the flood, appears uniquely in Berossus. It might be his own interpretive edition, explaining how antediluvian knowledge survived, or it might preserve authentic Babylonian tradition that earlier Sumerian texts didn't emphasize. Either way, it reveals sophisticated understanding of the knowledge transmission problem. If the flood destroyed everything, how did post-flood civilization know anything about pre-flood civilization? Berossus answers, written records, deliberately preserved, buried in sacred locations, recovered after the catastrophe. Knowledge survived because someone made sure it survived. The antediluvian kings didn't just rule, they documented their reigns, their deeds, their accumulated wisdom, ensuring future generations would have access to their history. After describing Sisuthros building the boat, surviving the flood, and being granted immortality, Berossus's account continues with the recovery of the buried texts. The flood survivors dig up the records at Sippar, read them, and use the information to rebuild civilization. They re-establish cities, restore temples, resume sacrifices, reinstitute kingship. The post-flood world is not a new beginning, but a restoration based on preserved templates. This is the same essential narrative as the Sumerian traditions, but with explicit emphasis on documentation and textual preservation. For Berossus, writing as a priest, whose profession depended on maintaining temple libraries and copying ancient texts, the scribal function was central to civilizational continuity. Scribes preserved knowledge. Libraries stored wisdom. Temple archives ensured that when catastrophe struck, survivors could recover what needed to be known. The Hellenistic world of the 3rd century BC operated with different assumptions than Bronze Age Mesopotamia. Greek philosophy emphasized reason, observation, logical argument. Greek historiography, pioneered by Herodotus and Thucydides, distinguished between mythological and historical past, attempting to establish facts through investigation and eyewitness testimony. Yet Berossus, trained in Babylonian priestly tradition, writing for Greek readers, maintained the old chronological framework. He presented the 432,000 years of antediluvian kingship as fact, not metaphor. He anchored Babylonian history in the same cosmic time frame the Sumerians used 2 millennia earlier. His Greek patrons might have found this absurd. Herodotus himself mocked the Egyptians for claiming their civilization was thousands of years old, but Berossus preserved the tradition anyway. Why? If he wanted his history to be taken seriously by Greek readers, why not adjust the chronology to something more plausible? Why not treat the antediluvian section as mythology and begin his factual account with the post-flood period? The answer might be that Berossus couldn't adjust it. He was working from temple archives, from king lists and chronicles maintained for millennia. His authority as a historian derived from his access to these texts and his ability to read them. If he started inventing alternative chronologies, he would undermine his own credibility and betray his priestly responsibility to transmit tradition accurately. Or perhaps Berossus believed the tradition. Perhaps, having spent his life studying cuneiform tablets in Babylonian temples, having read hundreds of texts spanning centuries, having observed the consistency of the antediluvian framework across sources, he concluded the tradition preserved authentic historical memory, even if the numbers were difficult to interpret. Or perhaps Berossus recognized something modern scholars often miss, that the 432,000 years might encode information in non-literal format. Ancient Near Eastern scribes were comfortable with multiple registers of meaning. A text could be historically accurate, symbolically significant, mathematically structured, and theologically meaningful simultaneously. The antediluvian numbers might be literally false, but informationally true, communicating something about time, cycles, cosmic structure, or astronomical periods in numerical form. The number 432,000 has interesting properties. It's 120/3600, 12 squared times 10 squared. It's divisible by many significant Mesopotamian numbers, 60, 360, 3600. Some scholars have noted it approximates half a precession cycle, the 25,920 year period, during which Earth's axial precession causes the position of the celestial poles to shift. Whether this is meaningful or coincidental depends on how sophisticated you think Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge was. What matters more than the specific number is that Berossus preserved it. In the 3rd century BC, 2,000 years after the Sumerian king list was compiled, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek maintained the same chronological framework. The tradition was stable across millennia. It survived translation between languages. It survived the collapse of Sumerian civilization, the rise and fall of empires, conquest by Persians and Greeks. Why does a tradition persist that long if it's merely invented mythology? Invented traditions change rapidly, adapting to current political needs. Myths evolve as cultures change, but this tradition remains stable. 8 to 10 antediluvian rulers, impossibly long reigns measured in Saroi, 5 sacred cities, catastrophic flood, civilizational restart. The persistence suggests the tradition was considered important, not just entertaining stories, but essential information worth preserving accurately, something that later generations would need to know, something that explained not just where Mesopotamian civilization came from, but what kind of reality it operated within. Berossus was among the last who could read the old cuneiform tablets. By the 3rd century BC, Greek and Aramaic were replacing Akkadian as administrative and literary languages. The scribal schools that had trained copyists for millennia were closing. The temple libraries were being neglected. Within a few centuries, no one would be able to read the ancient texts at all. But Berossus translated them into Greek, making them accessible to the dominant culture of his time. He ensured that the tradition survived the death of cuneiform literacy, and through Josephus, Eusebius, and other late antique writers who quoted him, fragments of that tradition survived into the Christian era and eventually to modern scholarship. This chain of transmission, from Sumerian scribes to Akkadian translators to Babylonian priests to Greek historians to early Christian chronographers to medieval copyists to modern archaeologists, represents exactly what the tradition itself describes: knowledge preserved through catastrophic transitions by people who understood its importance. Each link in the chain involves someone making a choice. The Sumerian scribe chose to copy the king list rather than letting it deteriorate. The Akkadian translator chose to preserve the antediluvian section rather than discarding it as irrelevant. Berossus chose to include it in his Greek history rather than starting with more plausible material. Josephus chose to quote it rather than dismissing it as absurd. Each person at each stage made a decision that this tradition mattered. Why? What did they think they were preserving? What information did they believe future generations would need? Perhaps the knowledge that catastrophe is cyclical, that civilization has ended before and restarted, that the pattern can be maintained if survivors preserve essential knowledge, that we are not the first to build cities, keep records, organise societies, and face the possibility that everything we build might be destroyed. Perhaps Berossus, watching Greek culture overwhelm Babylonian tradition, seeing the old temples converted to new purposes, observing the scribal schools close, understood that he was living through a kind of cultural flood. The antediluvian world was ending, the world where people read cuneiform, worshipped Marduk, maintained the old rituals. A new world was beginning, Hellenized, Greek-speaking, oriented toward different gods and different ways of knowing. In that moment of transition, Berossus did what the tradition taught flood survivors to do. He preserved what needed to be preserved. He buried the knowledge in a form that future generations could dig up and understand. He ensured that when people eventually wanted to know how Mesopotamian civilization began, they would have access to what the Babylonians themselves believed. The tradition says, this has happened before, it's happening again. When it does, remember the pattern. Remember the antediluvian kings, the flood, the restart. Remember that civilization is not inevitable. Remember that knowledge is fragile. Remember that you are responsible for transmission to the next cycle. Berossus remembered. He transmitted. And because he did, we can still read about Aluros and Xisuthros and the 432,000 years of kingship before the flood swept over. The chain remains intact, however fragile, however close it came to breaking. The pattern survives in fragments, but fragments can be reconstructed if enough pieces remain. That might be the most important lesson the tradition offers. Fragments are enough. Perfect preservation is not necessary. If enough pieces survive, future generations can reconstruct the pattern. Berossus didn't have access to all the original Sumerian texts. He worked from Babylonian copies and translations. Yet he preserved enough that we can recognize the continuity, trace the tradition back, understand what the Sumerians were documenting. We are 7 or more links down the transmission chain from those original Sumerian scribes who pressed cuneiform signs into wet clay 4,000 years ago. Yet we can still read what they wrote. We can still see the pattern they preserved. We can still ask the question they wanted us to ask. If this has happened before, what are we supposed to do with that knowledge? The silence of invention. Samuel Noah Kramer's 1956 book, History Begins at Sumer, catalogued 39 firsts attributed to Sumerian civilization. The first schools, first case of juvenile delinquency, first pharmacopoeia, first farmer's almanac, first bicameral congress, first historian, first case of tax reduction, first legal precedent, first proverbs, first animal fables, first literary debates, first biblical parallels, first Noah, first tale of resurrection, first St. George, first case of literary borrowing, first heroic age, first love song, first library catalogue, first golden age, first sixth society, first cosmogony and cosmology, first moral ideas, first Job, first lullaby, first literary imagery, first sex symbolism, first Mater Dolorosa, first long, distance champion, first literary revival, first messianic age, first parallel between Eden and Dilmun, first Cain and Abel, first David and Goliath. The list is impressive, though some entries are more defensible than others. Kramer's broader point was that Sumerian civilization provided the template for much of what we consider foundational to Western culture. They developed forms and ideas that subsequent civilizations, Babylonian, Assyrian, Hebrew, Greek, would adopt, adapt, and claim as their own. But notice what's missing from Kramer's approach. He assumes these are firsts in the sense of original inventions. First schools means the Sumerians invented schools. First legal precedent means they invented the concept of using past decisions to guide current judgments. First proverbs means they invented the proverb as a literary form. This is a modern assumption imposed on ancient material. Kramer reads the text through a developmental lens. Humanity progressed from simple to complex, from proliterate to literate, from tribal to urban, from chaotic to organized. The Sumerians happened to be the first society to cross certain thresholds, and later societies learned from their example. But the Sumerian texts don't describe invention or discovery. They describe acquisition, reception, inheritance. The me exist before humans implement them. The Apkallu teach what they already know. Enki possesses knowledge that he transmits rather than creates. Inanna steals what Enki guards. Ziusudra preserves what existed before the flood. Nowhere in Sumerian literature is there a text describing the invention of writing. There are texts about the importance of scribal training, about the difficulty of mastering cuneiform, about the status and privileges of educated scribes. But no text says this is how writing was invented, or this is the person who first thought of making marks on clay to represent speech. This absence is strange. Many cultures have foundation myths explaining how important cultural technologies originated. Native American traditions describe how fire was stolen from the sky. Greek myths attribute various inventions to gods or heroes, Prometheus giving fire to humans, Athena inventing the plough, Hermes creating the lyre. Chinese traditions credit specific legendary emperors with inventing writing, agriculture, silk cultivation. But Sumerians don't have these myths, or rather, their myths attribute these technologies to non-human teachers. The Apkallu brought the arts of civilization from the water. Enki possessed the me in his subterranean temple. Inanna acquired the me through trickery. But no human invented them. Even when texts describe specific kings as builders or innovators, they're implementing divine designs, not inventing new systems. The temple at Eridu was built according to patterns established by the gods. The laws of Ur-Nammu and later Hammurabi are presented as codifications of divine justice, not human inventions of legal principles. The kings are administrators, not innovators. This creates a puzzle for modern interpretation. We know writing was invented, archaeological evidence shows the developmental sequence, tokens used for accounting, impressions of tokens in clay, pictographic representations of objects, phonetic signs representing sounds, fully syllabic script. The process took centuries and involved numerous incremental improvements. Yet the Sumerians, who lived through this developmental process, who experienced the progression from simple to complex writing systems, didn't describe it as invention. They described writing as knowledge transmitted by the Apkallu, as part of the me that Enki possessed, as something acquired rather than created. Why would they frame it this way? Several possibilities suggest themselves. First, cultural memory may have attributed writing to an earlier source that was lost or forgotten. If an earlier civilization, the Ubaid culture, or a yet earlier population used some form of graphic communication that the Sumerians encountered and developed further, they might have remembered it as taught rather than invented. The development would still be real, but the cultural memory would attribute the origin elsewhere. Second, the teacher-student transmission model reflects how knowledge actually spreads. No individual invents writing from scratch. Each generation of scribes learns from the previous generation, adding small improvements, but always working within an inherited system. From any individual scribe's perspective, writing is something they learned, not something they created. Generations of scribes experiencing writing as inherited knowledge could produce a cultural framework where all knowledge is understood as inherited. Third, attributing knowledge to divine or non-human sources provides stability and authority. If writing is a human invention, it can be changed by human decision. If writing is part of the cosmic me taught by the Apkallu and guarded by Enki, it has divine sanction and should not be altered. The attribution functions as intellectual property protection, ensuring the system maintains consistency across time and space. Fourth, the Sumerians might have understood something we've forgotten. Perhaps invention as we conceive it, individual creativity producing genuinely new ideas, is not how complex cultural systems actually develop. Perhaps all human culture is recombination of pre-existing elements, patterns that emerge from constraints rather than conscious design. Perhaps the Sumerian framework is more accurate than our modern assumption of innovation. This last possibility is worth exploring. When we examine historical inventions, they're almost never entirely new. They recombine existing elements in novel ways. The printing press combines wine press technology with metallurgy and ink chemistry. The computer combines logic, electrical engineering, and mathematics. Even revolutionary scientific theories build on previous frameworks, data, and instruments. True creation from nothing may not be how human knowledge works. We're always inheriting vast frameworks of language, mathematics, tool use, social organization, and building incrementally within those frameworks. From that perspective, the Sumerian model is accurate. Knowledge is inherited and transmitted, with each generation adding small modifications but never creating the fundamental structures from scratch. If this is correct, then asking who invented writing is the wrong question. Writing emerged from the accumulated practice of thousands of anonymous accountants, merchants, temple administrators, and scribes, each contributing small improvements to systems inherited from predecessors. No individual invented it, because invention was a collective, incremental process occurring over generations. The Sumerians encoded this understanding in their attribution to the Apkallu. Instead of claiming we invented writing, which would be false, no individual Sumerian invented writing, they said writing was taught to us by the Apkallu, which is functionally accurate. The knowledge came from before, was transmitted across generations, was learned rather than invented. This same pattern applies to every other first on Kramer's list. Did Sumerians invent schools, or did the need to train scribes in complex writing systems inevitably produce institutions we recognize as schools? Did Sumerians invent laws, or did the need to organize city-states with thousands of inhabitants inevitably produce codified rules we recognize as legal systems? Perhaps the Sumerians didn't invent these things at all. Perhaps they discovered them, recognizing patterns inherent in social organization, implementing structures that emerge naturally when populations reach certain thresholds. The me might represent these emergent structures, not arbitrary human inventions, but necessary patterns for complex society to function. In this reading, the Sumerian framework is sophisticated systems theory. They understood that certain social technologies are not invented but discovered, not created but implemented, not original but universal. Any civilization complex enough to need them will develop similar institutions because the institutions emerge from the functional requirements of civilized life. The flood tradition fits this framework. When catastrophe destroys civilization, the superficial elements are lost: specific buildings, individual people, current power structures. But the me survive because they're not physical objects. They're patterns, templates, structural principles. As long as survivors remember the patterns, civilization can restart according to the same template. This explains why post-flood civilization resembles pre-flood civilization. The survivors didn't have to reinvent social organization from first principles. They implemented the me they had preserved: kingship, priesthood, agriculture, writing, and those implementations look similar to pre-flood implementations because they were following the same patterns. It also explains why different civilizations developed similar structures. The ziggurat and the pyramid serve similar functions and emerge from similar architectural logic. Cuneiform and hieroglyphics are different in detail but similar in structure. Both are mixed logographic syllabic systems developed for administrative purposes. Sumerian and Egyptian kingship have different mythologies but similar institutional forms. If the me represent universal patterns for organizing complex societies, then similar me will appear in any civilization complex enough to require them. This doesn't require direct cultural transmission, though that certainly happened. It suggests deeper structural similarities emerging from shared human cognitive constraints and universal social needs. The Sumerian framework, understood this way, is not primitive or mythological. It's recognizing that civilization operates according to discoverable patterns, that those patterns can be documented and preserved, that survivors of catastrophe can restart civilization by implementing preserved patterns rather than starting from zero. Modern civilization operates on the same principle. We don't reinvent the wheel, literally or metaphorically. We inherit vast libraries of technical knowledge, social organization, legal precedent, mathematical theory, scientific understanding. Each generation adds incrementally, but the foundation is inherited. If catastrophe struck today, pandemic, nuclear war, climate collapse, asteroid impact, what would survivors need to preserve to restart civilization quickly? Not specific technologies, which would be useless without supporting infrastructure. They would need knowledge, how to organize society, how to preserve food, how to create tools, how to transmit information, how to make decisions collectively. They would need the me, and they would need to recognize that they weren't inventing these principles, but rediscovering and re-implementing what had been known before. The patterns that worked for the Sumerians would work again because they're based on human cognitive and social constraints that don't change. This is what the King List documents. Not one civilization's history, but the recurrence of the pattern. Kingship descends from heaven, the institutional form emerges or is re-implemented, cities are founded, population concentrates in defensible, administratively coherent units, culture flourishes, the me are successfully maintained and transmitted. Then catastrophe strikes and the cycle requires restart. The silence about invention in Sumerian texts is therefore not a gap, but a statement. They aren't describing invention because that's not what they were doing. They were maintaining patterns, transmitting knowledge, implementing templates. Their contribution was preservation and transmission, not creation. And perhaps that's a more realistic assessment of what any civilization does. We don't create civilization from nothing. We receive it from those who came before, maintain it during our lifetimes, and transmit it to those who follow. Our innovations are minor variations within massive inherited frameworks. Our glory is not in creating, but in preserving well enough that the next cycle can begin. The Sumerians knew this. They built it into their cultural framework. They documented it in their king lists and flood narratives. They taught it through their myths about the me and the Apkallu. They understood that we are not the first, that patterns existed before us, that our responsibility is transmission. And if we are civilization number 7, that means 6 previous cycles succeeded at transmission well enough that the 7th could build on their foundations. The pattern survived 6 catastrophes. The me were preserved through 6 floods. The knowledge reached us because survivors in 6 previous iterations did their job correctly. The question is whether we're doing ours. 7 worlds, 7 memories. The evidence is gathered. The texts have spoken. The layers of archaeology and literature and linguistic analysis lie before us, like the stratified deposits at Ur, each level representing different attempts to understand the same underlying question. What did the Sumerians believe they were documenting? 3 interpretive frameworks present themselves, each coherent, each problematic, each demanding honest consideration. Framework 1. Pure mythology. The antediluvian section of the king list is invented tradition, legendary prehistory created to give Sumerian kingship, divine antiquity, and cosmic authority. The 8 kings are mythological figures like Greek titans, narrative placeholders representing the time before time when gods and humans interacted directly. The impossible reign lengths are deliberately fantastic, signalling to readers that this section occupies different conceptual space than historical records. When ancient audiences heard Alulim reigned 28,800 years, they understood this as mythological time, not chronological claim. The flood tradition is universal Near Eastern myth, explaining why bad things happen, why death is inevitable, why civilization exists in its current imperfect form. The catastrophe provides narrative explanation for the transition from mythological to historical past. This interpretation aligns with mainstream scholarship. It fits patterns seen in other ancient cultures, Greeks placing their history after Deucalion's flood, Chinese traditions describing sage emperors before the historical dynasties, Hindu texts dividing time into vast cosmic ages preceding the current era. Evidence supporting this framework, multiple flood traditions across cultures, suggests shared mythological structure rather than historical memory. The mathematical regularity of antediluvian reign lengths suggests symbolic construction rather than recorded facts. The absence of archaeological evidence for civilization ending floods. The implausibility of 28,800-year reigns by any measurement standard. Problems with this framework: it doesn't explain the consistency of the tradition across millennia. Invented mythologies change rapidly, adapting to political needs of current rulers. The king list maintained the same impossible numbers, same structural formula, same antediluvian section, even when kings had obvious incentives to modify the tradition to support their claims. It doesn't explain why the flood serves as absolute chronological boundary in all Mesopotamian historical texts. It requires assuming scribes who are mathematically sophisticated and administratively precise somehow confused mythology with documentation when compiling king lists. Framework 2. Symbolic/philosophical encoding. The antediluvian section encodes knowledge in numerical and narrative form. The 241,200 years represent astronomical cycles, calendrical periods, or mathematical relationships significant to Mesopotamian science. The 8 kings symbolize cosmic principles or stages of development. The flood represents epistemological boundary, the limit of recoverable historical knowledge. Everything before the flood is by definition unknowable because the flood destroyed the evidence. The antediluvian section acknowledges this limit while preserving whatever fragmentary memories survived. The tradition functions as philosophical statement about the nature of time, the fragility of knowledge, the cyclical pattern of order and chaos. It's not meant to be historically accurate, but conceptually true, capturing patterns that transcend specific historical events. This interpretation appeals to scholars who recognize sophistication in Mesopotamian thought but resist literal readings. It acknowledges the tradition's importance while maintaining critical distance from its face value claims. Evidence supporting this framework: Mesopotamian expertise in astronomy, mathematics, and symbolic systems makes encoding information in numerical form plausible. The tradition's persistence suggests deep cultural importance beyond entertainment value. The philosophical richness of Mesopotamian literature supports reading texts as multi-layered symbolic compositions. Problems with this framework: it requires assuming scribes encoded information without providing decoding keys. The texts give no indication the numbers should be read symbolically. No ancient commentary explains the hidden meaning. Modern scholars can generate multiple competing symbolic interpretations, none privileged over others, suggesting we're imposing meaning rather than recovering authorial intent. If this is encoded knowledge, what exactly is encoded, and why hasn't anyone definitively decoded it after centuries of scholarship? Framework 3. Preserved catastrophe memory. The antediluvian section preserves institutional memory of previous civilizational cycles. The 8 kings represent epochs or dynasties compressed into individual reigns. The impossible years result from different time-keeping systems, lost units of measurement, or chronological compression of deep history. The flood tradition preserves actual catastrophe memory, not one universal deluge, but recurring floods that periodically disrupted Mesopotamian civilization. Archaeological evidence confirms major flooding events around 2900 BCE and earlier. These catastrophes destroyed cities, displaced populations, and required survivors to rebuild. The pattern documented in the King List, antediluvian civilization, catastrophic flood, post-flood restart, occurred multiple times across millennia. Each iteration involved survivors preserving knowledge, transmitting cultural patterns, re-implementing successful organizational structures. The Sumerians understood themselves as heir to previous attempts at civilization, rebuilding according to preserved templates. This interpretation takes the texts seriously as historical documentation, while acknowledging the numbers are not literal. It recognizes that pre-literate history could be preserved in oral tradition and later documented with temporal distortions. It explains why the tradition was so stable. It contained information survivors considered essential for future rebuilds. Evidence supporting this framework: the sudden appearance of Sumerian civilization with fully formed complexity, the archaeological discontinuity between Ubaid and Uruk periods, the Sumerian concept of me as inherited rather than invented knowledge, the Apkallu tradition describing non-human teachers, the consistent structure of flood narratives across languages and centuries, the geological evidence for catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia, the cultural emphasis on preservation and transmission rather than innovation. Problems with this framework: it requires explaining how knowledge survived catastrophic enough to destroy cities and populations. It struggles with the 241,200 year total, even allowing for chronological compression or different measurement units. It risks sliding into speculation about lost civilizations for which there's no archaeological evidence. It requires taking seriously ancient claims that modern scholarship has dismissed as mythology. None of these frameworks is entirely satisfying. Each explains some evidence while leaving other evidence problematic. Each is coherent internally but requires accepting assumptions that may not be justified. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is uncertainty. We don't know what the Sumerian scribes believed they were documenting because we cannot access their assumptions, their conceptual frameworks, their understanding of what constituted valid historical knowledge. What we can say with confidence: the Sumerian king list was compiled and recopied across centuries, maintaining consistent structure despite political changes. The antediluvian section was important enough to preserve on dedicated tablets. The flood tradition appeared across multiple genres, king lists, epics, wisdom literature, suggesting it was foundational to Mesopotamian historical consciousness. The Sumerians conceptualized civilization as inherited rather than invented. Knowledge came from the Apkallu, the me existed before their implementation. Writing was taught rather than discovered. Their cultural memory emphasized preservation and transmission over innovation and development. They understood catastrophe as recurring threat. The flood was not unique but potentially repeatable. Cities built temples on platforms as much for flood protection as divine worship. Divination focused heavily on predicting disaster. Cultural transmission was urgent because the next catastrophe could come at any time. They succeeded at transmission. 4,000 years later, we can read their tablets, understand their language, reconstruct their history. The patterns survived. The knowledge reached us. Whatever they were trying to preserve made it through time's catastrophes to the present. If the tradition is meant to teach something, perhaps it's this. Civilizations rise and fall, catastrophes recur, knowledge is fragile, transmission is essential, patterns can survive if deliberately maintained. Whether we are literally civilization number 7 is less important than whether we understand ourselves as part of a sequence. Not the first to build cities, keep records, organize societies, not the last either, if we fulfill the responsibility every civilization has, preserving what matters, transmitting what's essential, maintaining the pattern. The Sumerians built that understanding into their cultural foundation. They documented themselves as preservers and transmitters, not originators. They positioned their civilization within a longer sequence, acknowledging predecessors and anticipating successors. This humility, knowing we are not first and not final, might be the most important lesson the ancient texts offer. It prevents hubris. It encourages preservation. It reminds us that what we build is temporary, but what we transmit can be permanent. The clay tablets sitting in museum vaults are testament to this principle. Fragile, broken, scattered across collections worldwide, yet they survive. The World Blundell prism at the Ashmolean still clearly shows its cuneiform signs 4,000 years after they were pressed. CBS Template 673 at Penn Museum, despite its damaged sections, still preserves the flood narrative. The pattern survives in fragments, but fragments are enough. If catastrophe struck today, if our digital archives corrupted, our infrastructure collapsed, our population scattered, what would future archaeologists recover? What would they conclude about whether we understood ourselves as part of a longer sequence or as uniquely privileged modernity? Would they find evidence that we preserved essential knowledge, that we documented our civilization's pattern, that we acknowledged the possibility of collapse and prepared for survivors to rebuild? Or would they conclude we believed our civilization was permanent, our knowledge secure, our progress inevitable? The Sumerian approach was different. They built for catastrophe, they preserved for survivors, they transmitted for the next cycle. Whether that next cycle would come in 50 years or 5,000, they couldn't predict, but they ensured that when it came, the survivors would have access to the pattern. 8 antediluvian kings, 5 sacred cities, 241,200 years of cosmic time. Then the flood swept over. Then kingship descended from heaven again. The cycle continued because someone remembered the pattern. We have inherited that memory. The question is what we do with it. The question that remains. The World Blundell prism sits in its climate-controlled case at the Ashmolean Museum. The overhead lights illuminate its surface carefully, bright enough for viewing, dim enough to prevent deterioration. The 4 sides display their columns of cuneiform signs with perfect clarity. Thousands of wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet clay in Lhasa 4,000 years ago. Visitors walk past it daily. Some pause, read the museum placard explaining what it is, the Sumerian king list, the most complete copy ever found, documenting rulers from mythology to history. Most visitors glance at the small clay object, find it less visually impressive than the Egyptian sarcophagi or Greek sculptures nearby, and move on. The prism doesn't demand attention. It's brown clay, hand-sized, decorated only with script in a dead language that almost no one can read. It doesn't gleam like the golden artifacts in the treasure rooms. It doesn't tower like the monumental stone sculptures. It doesn't depict dramatic battle scenes or beautiful gods. It's documentation, pure information, preserved through time. Yet this small object carries something that gold and stone cannot, the conscious thought of the people who created it. Not artistic vision or religious devotion or political propaganda, but their understanding of who they were, where they came from, what pattern they belonged to. The scribe who copied this king list in Lhasa didn't invent the text. They were working from earlier copies, maintained in temple archives, passed down through generations of scribes. Their job was perfect replication, reproducing exactly what the tradition preserved. They could have skipped the antediluvian section. It would have made their job easier. Fewer signs to copy, less risk of error. The post-flood kings were the ones that mattered politically, recent enough to be historically verifiable, relevant to current dynastic claims. The antediluvian rulers were remote, mythological, impossible, but the scribe included them, copied every name, every reign length, every formula, preserved the pattern complete. Why? Because this was knowledge that needed to survive, because the tradition was more important than convenience, because someone, somewhere in the future, might need to know that kingship had descended from heaven before, that cities had existed before the flood, that civilization had restarted according to patterns that survivors preserved. That future is now. We are the ones reading what the ancient scribe copied. We are the ones trying to understand what they thought they were documenting. We are the ones asking whether their framework captures something true. Are we civilization number 7? Literally, probably not. The arithmetic doesn't work. The archaeology doesn't support 7 sequential civilization, destroying catastrophes followed by complete rebuilds. If we take 7 as precise count, the framework fails. But if we take 7 as symbolic, as multiple, as many times, as this has happened repeatedly, the framework becomes more defensible. Human civilization has experienced catastrophic disruptions. Ice ages, climate shifts, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, floods, droughts, epidemics, migrations, collapses. The archaeological record shows discontinuities, abandoned settlements, population crashes, technological losses. Most regions developed civilization multiple times. Egypt's pharaonic civilization followed earlier Neolithic settlements and was followed by later Islamic civilization, different languages, religions, political systems, but always on the Nile. Mesopotamia saw Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Arabs, each building on and transforming what came before. China experienced dynastic cycles and invasions, but maintained cultural continuity. Mesoamerica had Olmec, Maya, Toltec, Aztec, each distinct, each building on earlier achievements. From this perspective, we are not civilization number 1, or even civilization number 7. We are civilization number innumerable, one iteration in a long sequence of human attempts to organize complex societies, each one building on preserved knowledge from previous attempts, each one contributing new developments, each one facing the possibility of catastrophic disruption. The Sumerian insight wasn't mathematical precision about exactly how many times this had happened. It was recognizing the pattern, civilization emerges, flourishes, faces catastrophe, transmits knowledge to survivors, restarts. The cycle has occurred many times. It will likely occur again. The question is always whether survivors preserve enough to rebuild effectively. The king list documents successful transmission. After the flood, kingship descended again. The pattern survived. The me were preserved. Cities were re-established. Civilization continued. This represents success, not avoiding catastrophe, which may be impossible, but maintaining continuity through catastrophe. We face different catastrophes than the Sumerians. Our cities flood less often, though rising sea levels may change this. Our primary existential threats are climate change, nuclear weapons, engineered pandemics, artificial intelligence, ecological collapse, modern problems requiring modern solutions. But the underlying challenge is the same. How do we preserve what matters through discontinuity? How do we ensure that if catastrophe strikes, survivors can rebuild effectively? What knowledge is essential? What patterns must be maintained? How do we transmit across the gap that catastrophe creates? The Sumerians answered by building redundancy. They copied texts obsessively. They established scribal schools across many cities. They embedded essential knowledge in multiple forms, king lists, myths, proverbs, rituals. They built on previous foundations, maintaining continuity with obeyed period settlement patterns while developing new capabilities. They understood themselves as transmitters in a long chain. We have different tools. Digital storage can preserve vast quantities of information. Global networks allow rapid information distribution. Multiple independent archives can back up each other. We can document our civilization's technical achievements, cultural patterns, philosophical insights in forms that might survive technological disruption. But digital archives are fragile. Electromagnetic pulses could erase them, format obsolescence could render them unreadable, infrastructure collapse could eliminate the technology needed to access them. Physical media, paper, stone, metal, remains more reliable across centuries than any digital format. The Sumerians wrote on clay. Fired clay is virtually indestructible. Buried for 4,000 years, exposed to moisture and temperature changes, broken and scattered, clay tablets survive. The wedges pressed into their surfaces remain perfectly legible. No power source is needed to read them. No special equipment is required beyond knowledge of the script. This is robust information storage. The medium is the durability. If we wanted to preserve essential information for post-catastrophe survivors, what would we save? Not everything. Storage has limits. Not specialized technical knowledge that requires extensive infrastructure to implement, but the patterns, how to organize society, how to preserve food, how to make decisions collectively, how to transmit knowledge across generations, how to avoid common failure modes, the me, in other words, the essential structures that make civilization function, preserved in forms that could survive catastrophe and remain accessible to survivors with basic literacy. Perhaps that's what the Sumerian king list really is, a template for civilizational restart. It shows that kingship political authority descends from heaven, merges from social necessity, or is re-implemented from preserved knowledge. It shows that this has happened multiple times, diluvian and post-flood, with many dynasties afterward. It shows that catastrophe interrupts, but doesn't permanently destroy the pattern. It shows that the sequence continues, will continue, requires continuing. The question that remains is not whether the antediluvian kings literally lived for 28,800 years. That question admits of no satisfying answer. The mathematics is impossible, the chronology is compressed, the literal reading fails. The question that remains is whether we understand ourselves as part of a sequence, whether we recognize that human civilization has been built and destroyed and rebuilt many times, whether we accept responsibility for preservation and transmission, whether we prepare for the possibility that everything we build might be destroyed and survivors might need what we preserved. The Sumerians believed they were civilization number 2, post-flood, or perhaps number 8 if we count the antediluvian kings, or perhaps number innumerable if we recognize that the pattern extends further back than their records could preserve. We might be civilization number 7 if we count major global cultures, or civilization number 2 in our current technological phase, or civilization number innumerable if we count every society that has organized itself according to similar patterns. The precise number doesn't matter. What matters is recognizing the pattern, understanding that we are not unique, accepting that we are not permanent, preparing for the possibility that survivors will need to rebuild. And if that seems pessimistic, consider the alternative, assuming civilization is permanent, knowledge is secure, catastrophe is impossible. That assumption breeds complacency. It discourages preservation. It concentrates knowledge in fragile forms. It increases the risk that when catastrophe strikes, and history suggests it will, survivors will have to start from zero. The Sumerian approach was different. Prepare for catastrophe. Preserve essential knowledge. Maintain the pattern. Accept that this has happened before and will happen again. Ensure that when it does, survivors have access to what they need. This is not pessimism. This is robust optimism. It's confidence that human civilization can survive catastrophe if we prepare properly, that the pattern is stronger than individual implementations. That knowledge, carefully preserved, transcends the civilizations that created it. The clay remembers. 4,000 years after Sumerian scribes pressed their styluses into wet tablets, we can read their thoughts. We know their kings, their cities, their flood tradition, their understanding of where they fit in the long sequence of human civilization. If we remember, if we preserve, if we transmit, then 4,000 years from now, whoever